He mopped floors nobody cared about, in hallways nobody watched, for a company that didn't know his name. But on the night everything collapsed, when the CEO vanished, when the alarms went silent, when trained security officers stood frozen and useless, it was the janitor who moved. Not because someone ordered him to, because he had done this before, in darker places, against worse men, and he had sworn he would never go back. Some promises don't survive contact with an innocent woman's life. If this story already has you, hit subscribe, because the ones coming after this will shake you even harder. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The third-floor men's restroom smelled like industrial cleaner and old pipe water, and Elias Varden had stopped noticing that smell years ago. He worked the mop in slow, even strokes across the tile, moving from left to right, the way he always did, muscle memory doing the job while his mind did something else entirely. Outside the frosted window, the city was full dark. Inside Aegis Meridian Technologies, the overnight skeleton crew had settled into their routines, the security officer at the front desk scrolling his phone, the server room technician running his third cup of coffee from the break room machine, the cleaning supervisor, Donna, somewhere on floor 5 complaining about the wax buildup near the elevator banks. Elias was 37 years old. He had the kind of face that people looked past without quite meaning to, not unpleasant, not memorable. A small scar ran along his left jaw, which most people assumed came from a bicycle accident or a bad fall in his teens. Nobody at Aegis Meridian had ever asked. Nobody had ever been curious enough. His daughter, Nora, was 9. She was asleep right now in their apartment 6 blocks east of here, under the supervision of Mrs. Galvez from 4B, who charged $40 a night and always left the television on too loud. Elias had calculated, when he took this job 2 years ago, that the overnight rate plus the cleaning supervisor bonus he'd eventually earn would cover rent, Nora's school supplies, and 1 modest vacation per year if they were careful. He had not taken a vacation yet. He was still being careful. He pulled the mop cart toward the hallway and noticed, as he always did, the subtle shift in the building's atmosphere around 11:30 p.m. The fluorescent lights on the administrative corridor clicked to low power mode. The air system dropped to its nighttime cycle, quieter and slightly cooler. For most of the overnight crew, this was the signal to slow down. For Elias, it was just background noise. He had learned, 12 years ago, and in places most people would never see on any map, how to read the background noise of an environment, which sounds belonged and which ones didn't, which shadows moved naturally and which ones moved because something was making them move. His SEAL instructors had called it environmental fluency. Elias had eventually stopped calling it anything at all. It was just how he processed the world now, as involuntary as breathing. He did not talk about that. Not at Aegis Meridian, not anywhere. But the CEO of Aegis Meridian Technologies was not supposed to be in the building at 11:45 p.m. on a Wednesday. Elias knew this because he paid attention to patterns, and Celeste Arden's pattern was consistent. She arrived at 7:10 in the morning, left between 7 and 8 in the evening, occasionally returned on Sunday afternoons during quarter end. She did not do late nights. He saw her for the first time that evening through the glass partition of the 4th-floor conference room. She was standing at the far end of the table, alone, her laptop open, one hand braced against the table surface, and her head tilted in the way people tilt their heads when something they're reading does not make sense and they want it to make sense. Elias noticed her the same way he noticed everything, briefly, catalogued, filed. He moved on. He had interacted with Celeste Arden exactly once in 2 years. 3 months earlier, a floor manager named Preston Hollis had cornered Elias near the service elevator and dressed him down in front of 4 other employees because a trash liner had been left improperly sealed near the executive kitchen. Preston had the specific talent of making small problems feel like enormous moral failures, and he had been warming up to a second round when Celeste had come around the corner, stopped, and looked at Preston with an expression that was not angry exactly, just flat and very direct. "Is this related to a security issue?" she had asked. Preston had blinked. "Ma'am?" "The conversation. Is it operationally urgent?" No, it's a quality control. Then have it privately, and once." She had looked at Elias briefly, something that might have been acknowledgement in her expression, and walked on. Preston had not spoken to Elias since. Elias had not forgotten. It was the kind of small thing that revealed something real about a person. Not the grand gesture, not the boardroom speech, but the moment when someone in power chose to spend 30 seconds they didn't have to spend, just because it was the right thing to do. At 11:52 p.m., Elias turned his cart around the corner of the B-level administrative corridor and stopped. There was a document on the floor. Not dropped accidentally, placed. Folded once, corner visible, positioned in the narrow gap between the fire door and its frame, as if someone had slid it through deliberately and let it fall. Elias looked up and down the corridor. Empty. He pulled on a nitrile glove. He kept a box in the cart, standard for handling waste, and picked up the document. He unfolded it. It was a schematic. Specifically, it was a partial floor diagram of Aegis Meridian's underground parking garage and the subterranean maintenance corridor beneath it. Someone had marked it by hand, blue ink, careful and precise. Camera positions were circled. Along the western service tunnel, 3 sections had been crossed out and marked with a small notation. Dead angle, 0015, 0045. Camera dead angles. Time specific. There were also small arrows indicating vehicle movement, extraction routes. Elias stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the document. Then he took it to security. The overnight security supervisor on duty was a man named Garrett Foles, who had worked corporate security for 11 years and had the practiced patience of someone who had spent a decade dealing with employees who thought they had discovered something significant. He looked at the document. He looked at Elias. "Where'd you find this?" "B corridor, near the fire door on the administrative wing." Garrett turned the schematic over, checked the back, set it flat on his desk. "Probably a maintenance planning doc. Engineering runs these for camera maintenance scheduling." "Engineering marks them in red and stamps them with the department header," Elias said. "That's blue ink. Handwritten. And those notations aren't maintenance notes, they're observation windows." Garrett looked at him with the specific expression of a man reassessing whether this conversation was going to require more energy than he currently had available. "You a security professional?" "I clean floors." "Right." Garrett picked up the document, tucked it under his desk. "I'll log it and flag it for the morning team. Anything else?" Elias could have pushed. He had the language for it. The precise technical vocabulary that would have reframed this from a janitor's concern to an operational intelligence flag. He could have said pre-surveillance indicator or extraction corridor mapping and watched Garrett's expression change. He didn't. He nodded, took his cart, and went back to work. Later, he would think about that moment. Not with guilt exactly, because guilt was only useful if it changed something, but with the particular sharpness of a man who recognized the point at which he made a choice and what it cost. At 12:17 a.m., the 4th floor conference room was empty. Celeste Arden's laptop was gone. The room lights were off. Elias was on the ground floor, running his standard sweep through the lobby, when the elevator chimed. He glanced up. Celeste stepped out, laptop bag over one shoulder, her phone pressed to her ear. She looked tired in the way that people who refuse to show tiredness look tired. Posture still straight, expression still composed, but the eyes carrying something they hadn't been carrying at 7 in the morning. She crossed the lobby toward the main entrance, paused, changed direction toward the elevator bank that led to the underground parking. Elias watched her go. He wasn't sure why he kept watching after she disappeared around the corner. He finished his lobby sweep, moved his cart to the supply closet, and started the process of refilling the mop bucket. The building was quiet. The security desk monitor showed the parking garage feed, and through the glass partition he could see the small pixelated image of Celeste walking toward the P2 level. Then the feed went black. Not dark. Black. The difference between a camera losing light and a camera being cut. Elias was already moving before he'd consciously decided to move. The stairwell to the underground garage smelled like concrete dust and exhaust residue. Elias took the steps 2 at a time, not running. Running made noise, noise gave position, but moving at the controlled, deliberate pace that his body remembered even after 7 years of trying to forget it. He pushed through the P1 door, crossed the upper deck. Nothing. He took the ramp to P2 at the same pace. He was 4 seconds too late. He knew it the moment he came around the concrete pillar because the tire marks were already there. Fresh rubber, sharp angle turn, The kind of exit a driver makes when speed matters more than not being noticed. The overhead lights on P2 were still functioning, which meant the camera blackout had been targeted and surgical. And Celeste Arden was gone. But she had not gone quietly. On the concrete floor near the rear elevator door, a thin line of footprints told a partial story. 2 sets of heavy boots, wide-spaced, military heel strike pattern. A scuff mark where someone had braced for resistance. And near the drain grate, barely visible, a small object. Elias crouched. A pen. Not dropped. Placed. Pointed east toward the service exit. Elias picked it up and felt the deliberate positioning in his chest like a cold wire. She had known, or suspected, what was happening. She had left something behind, something that pointed in a direction. He stood up and pulled his phone from his pocket. He stood there for a moment, the phone in his hand, and felt the specific sensation of a man standing at the exact edge of the life he had built and the life he used to live, knowing that whichever direction he stepped, something would be different on the other side. He called 911. Then he called the front security desk. Then he went back upstairs and waited, because the man he was now knew that the next moves had to be made carefully, and because the man he used to be had already begun, quietly and without asking permission, to catalog everything he had just seen. The boot pattern, the tire angle, the soil trace on the concrete near the drain, reddish-brown clay that did not match the gray urban grit that normally collected in underground parking structures. Different soil. Specific soil. From somewhere else. Elias sat on the lobby bench and waited for the police to arrive. Around him, the building hummed its nighttime frequency, indifferent. And in the space behind his eyes, a part of Elias Varden that he had spent 7 years trying to retire was already working. Reading the ground, mapping the variables, running the problem the way it had been trained to run problems, with cold precision and no wasted motion. He pressed his hands together between his knees and watched the lobby doors. Nora would be asleep. Mrs. Galvez would have the television on too loud. He had never told Nora what he used to be. He had been very deliberate about that. She knew he had been in the Navy, the way children know certain facts about their parents, as background information, not as something that defined the shape of their daily life. She did not know about the missions. She did not know about the men he had trained alongside, or what had happened to 3 of them on a cold night in a country most Americans could not correctly locate on a map. She did not know that the scar on his jaw was not from a bicycle accident. She knew he cleaned floors. She knew he made pancakes on Saturday mornings and helped with her math homework and fell asleep on the couch during movies because his shift ended at 6 a.m. and the world didn't stop just because he was tired. She knew he was her father. That was what he had decided would be enough. He sat on the lobby bench and breathed slowly and thought about Celeste Arden's pen on the concrete floor, pointing east. And he thought about a classified facility floor plan he had seen years ago, in a different life, for a site that sat roughly 11 miles east-northeast of where he was currently sitting. The site had been decommissioned, officially closed, off the active inventory. Northwatch Station. Elias pressed his knuckles together, cracked them once, and watched the lobby doors. The police would arrive in 4 minutes. He knew this because he had estimated the response distance when he called. 4 minutes was enough time to decide what he was going to say, what he was going to withhold, and how much of himself he was willing to show before he understood exactly what he was dealing with. He had spent 7 years making himself invisible. He was not ready to stop. But Celeste Arden's pen was still in his jacket pocket, and it was pointing east, and somewhere out there, a woman who had spent 30 seconds defending a janitor she didn't know from a bully who should have known better was in the hands of people who did not care how the story ended for her. The lobby doors slid open. The first officer came through in a rush of cold night air. Elias stood up. "I found evidence in the parking garage," he said. "I need to show someone who will actually listen." The first officer's name was Reyes, and he was young enough that his jacket still had the stiff newness of recent Academy issue. He listened to Elias with the particular expression of someone trying to appear more patient than he felt, a pen hovering over a notepad, eyes moving between Elias and the lobby around them as if expecting something more dramatic to justify being called out at 12:30 in the morning. "And you said you found a document earlier? A schematic?" "Around 11:50. I gave it to the overnight security supervisor, Garrett Foles. He's at the desk." Reyes wrote the name down. "And your position here is maintenance, overnight. The pen paused. Not long. Just a half-second register of something that wasn't quite dismissal, but lived next door to it. Reyes finished writing and clicked the pen closed. Okay, we're going to need to get statements from everyone on shift. Is there a manager we can... The parking garage, Elias said. P2. The tire marks are still fresh and there's a soil trace near the drain that doesn't match the local substrate. Someone needs to look at it before the morning crew comes through and contaminates it. Reyes blinked. The local substrate. The dirt. It's the wrong color for this area. It's reddish clay. That's not city runoff. Another pause. Reyes looked at him more carefully this time, the kind of look people gave when the words coming out of someone's mouth didn't match the clothes they were wearing. Elias held the look without explanation. I'll have someone check the garage, Reyes said finally. It took 40 minutes for the situation to escalate to the point where people started paying real attention, and by then Elias had already told his story 3 times. Once to Reyes, once to a detective named Huang, who arrived at 1 a.m., and once to a security coordinator from Aegis Meridian's corporate emergency response team, a compact, efficient woman named Dana Solt, who wore the expression of someone calculating liability exposure while simultaneously processing a genuine crisis. The garage had been examined, photographed, taped off. Garrett Foles had produced the schematic from under his desk with the sheepish deliberateness of a man who understood, too late, that he had made an error in judgment. Nobody had found Celeste Arden. At 1:47 a.m., a federal investigator walked through the lobby doors, and the temperature of the room changed in the way it changes when someone enters who is used to being the highest authority present. Her name was Mara Ellison. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, with short, dark hair cut close on the sides, and she carried herself with the flat economy of motion that Elias associated with people who had learned, through long experience, not to waste energy on appearances. She wore a plain gray jacket, dark slacks, no visible badge, until she showed it to the Aegis Meridian security coordinator, and she took in the lobby in about 4 seconds the way experienced people take in rooms. Not obviously, not dramatically, just completely. She spoke with Detective Huang for 3 minutes. She looked at the photographs from the garage. She looked at the schematic. Then she looked across the lobby at Elias, who was sitting on the same bench where he'd been sitting when the police arrived, his mop cart still parked against the wall 20 feet away because nobody had told him he could go home, and he hadn't decided yet whether he should. Ellison walked over and sat down 2 seats from him. Elias Varden, she said. Not a question. Yes. You found the document at 11:52. You reported it to security. Security logged it, but didn't escalate. You then proceeded to the garage after observing the camera feed cut from the lobby security monitor. She looked at him. How did you know the feed cut wasn't a technical fault? The cut was instantaneous and isolated to the P2 camera. Technical faults usually cascade. You lose a section, not a single unit, and there's usually a flicker before dropout. This was clean. Someone with access to the system cut it manually. Ellison was quiet for a moment. How do you know what a manual camera cut looks like versus a technical fault? I've seen both. She let that sit. Outside, 2 more federal vehicles had pulled up to the curb, and the lobby was beginning to fill with people who moved with purpose. Ellison seemed in no hurry. The soil sample from the drain, she said, reddish clay. You mentioned it to Officer Reyes. That detail's not in any of the initial scene reports. Reyes wrote it down. He wrote down that you mentioned it. He didn't flag it as significant. She tilted her head slightly. But you did. Why? Elias thought about how to answer that. There was a version of the truth he could give her that would satisfy the question without opening any doors. There was another version that would open all of them. Because if someone is moving a high-value target by vehicle, they came from somewhere specific. The soil on those tires was transport residue from a different environment. That's directional information. Ellison studied him for a long moment. Her expression hadn't changed, but something behind her eyes had shifted. A recalibration, subtle and total. What's your background, Mr. Varden? I clean floors. Before that? Navy. She nodded slowly. Not satisfied, but not pressing. Not yet. She stood up, straightened her jacket. Stay available. I'm going to want to talk to you again. She walked back across the lobby, said something to one of her people, and disappeared into the corridor toward the security office. Elias sat on the bench. His hands were steady. They had been steady for 7 years, which was something he'd worked at, the way you work at anything that doesn't come naturally anymore. The video arrived at 2:19 a.m. It came through Aegis Meridian's general communications server. Not an email, not a direct message, but a file dropped into the company's external-facing upload portal, the one vendors use to submit documentation. Anonymous sender. No metadata. Just a file, and inside the file, 43 seconds of video. Elias was not in the room when they first played it. He was in the corridor outside the security office, close enough to the open door to hear it clearly. The footage was dim, shot in what looked like an interior room with concrete walls and no windows. Celeste Arden was seated in a metal chair, her wrists bound behind her with zip ties, a small cut above her right eyebrow that had dried to a thin, dark line. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on in the lobby, the charcoal blazer, the dark blouse. Her hair had come partially loose. She was looking directly at the camera, and despite everything, her posture was still controlled. Not calm, exactly. Controlled. A man stepped into frame from the right. He stood beside her rather than behind her, which told Elias something about how he thought about the shot. He wanted to be seen. He was somewhere north of 50, heavy-set in the chest and shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had the particular quality of a man who had made a career of intimidation and was comfortable in it. He wore no identifying markings. When he spoke, his voice was measured and unhurried, which was more unsettling than if he'd been aggressive. Aegis Meridian receives this communication as formal notice of terms. We require full access to the classified server architecture, complete administrative credentials, no partial handoff, no staged release. You have 6 hours from the timestamp of this file. At the 6-hour mark, if we have not received confirmation of access, the situation changes. He paused. Don't contact federal authorities. We'll know. And the timeline accelerates. The feed ended. In the silence after the video, Elias heard Dana Solt say, "They already know federal authorities are here." Someone else said, "They said don't contact. They sent a video to a company server." Ellison's voice cut in, flat. "They know we're here. That's a standard pressure tactic. Ignore it." Elias pushed the corridor door open and walked in. 3 people looked at him immediately. Ellison was the fourth to look, half a second later, and her look lasted longer than the others. "The man in the video," Elias said. "I need to see it again." "Mr. Varden, 30 seconds. I need to see it again." Something in the way he said it stopped the room. Ellison made a small gesture with 2 fingers. Someone replayed the file. Elias watched the man's posture, his weight distribution, the way he moved into frame. He watched the specific angle of the man's shoulders when he spoke, the slight forward lean, the planted feet. He watched the way the man's right hand rested near but not touching his own thigh, the habitual positioning of someone who had spent years with a sidearm there. He watched Celeste. He watched her very carefully. She spoke 11 words in the video, which none of the investigators had flagged yet because the 11 words sounded like nothing. "I'm not hurt badly. Please just cooperate with what they need." Please just cooperate with what they need. An odd construction. Most people under that kind of stress compress their language. Do what they say. Just give them what they want. The elongation was wrong. Elias played it again in his head. Not the words, but the rhythm. Please, just cooperate. With what they need. 7 syllables with a specific beat. He had heard that pattern before, a long time ago, in a classified communications training that most of the people currently standing in this room had never taken. Embedded signal. The phrasing wasn't accidental. She was marking something. He ran it again. Please just cooperate with what they need. The first letters. PJ, CWW. TN. Not quite. He was forcing it. He backed off and let his mind run it looser. What they need. Northwatch. WTN. No. Too easy. Too clean. He held on to it without grabbing at it. The room in the video, he said. Concrete. No windows. Industrial-grade construction, not commercial. You can see the ceiling in the upper left corner. It's poured concrete with wire reinforcement. That's military-spec construction from the late 80s, early 90s. Ellison turned fully toward him. Meaning it's not a warehouse, not an industrial park. It's a purpose-built facility. and it was built by or for the federal government. He paused. The soil in the parking garage was reddish clay. That clay composition is consistent with terrain in the northeastern county corridor, specifically the undeveloped land around the Palliser Flats. The room was quiet. There's a decommissioned military training complex 11 miles east-northeast of here, Elias said. Northwatch Station. It was taken off active inventory in 2009. It's been officially closed since 2011. It's in the right geographic corridor for that soil, and its subsurface construction matches what you can see in the video. A man in a blue jacket, FBI, from the body language, said, "How do you know about Northwatch Station?" Elias looked at him. "I've been there." The blue jacket man looked at Ellison. Ellison looked at Elias with the expression of someone completing a calculation they had started 40 minutes ago. "Excuse us," she said to the room, and then to Elias, "Walk with me." They went to a small glass-walled conference room at the end of the corridor, one of those corporate spaces that looked borrowed rather than used. A table, 6 chairs, a whiteboard with old marker ghost lines that hadn't fully wiped clean. Ellison closed the door. She didn't sit. "Your full name is Elias Thomas Varden," she said, age 37. Current address on file with HR is the Larkin Apartment Complex, Unit 4C. Single father, 1 dependent minor, Nora Varden, age 9. Prior to your employment at Aegis Meridian, you have approximately 18 months of documented civilian work history. She looked at him. "Before that, your record is sealed." "Yes." "I know what's in a sealed military record, Mr. Varden. I've opened enough of them." She waited. "I'd like you to tell me yourself." Elias pulled out one of the chairs and sat down, not because he needed to, but because standing felt like a posture choice, and he was done making posture choices tonight. 12 years Navy SEAL, last 4 years specializing in hostage rescue operations. Last active deployment was 7 years ago. It ended badly. I separated from service shortly after. "It ended badly," Ellison repeated. She said it without sarcasm, which meant she already knew what that meant. 3 men were killed, an ambush. The intelligence we were operating on was compromised, and the mission was a failure. He kept his voice level. It had taken years to keep it level when he said those words, and even now there was something underneath them that he kept his jaw tight against. "I was the senior officer. It fell on me." "Were you responsible?" "I made decisions that led to the deployment. Whether those decisions were the right ones, given the information I had at the time, is a question I've had 7 years to think about without reaching a conclusion that helps anyone." Ellison was quiet for a moment. "The man in the video," she said. "You recognized him." Elias looked at her. "What makes you think I recognized him?" "Because you asked to see it again, and when you watched it, you weren't studying the room. You were studying him, and for about 2 seconds your face did something it hasn't done once since I walked in here." Elias said nothing. "I need to know if you recognized him," she said. "Not officially. Not for a report. Right now, in this room." He let the silence sit for a moment. Then, "His name is Rourke Danner. He was a contractor, private military, operating in the same theater as my unit during my last deployment. He wasn't officially part of our operation. He was adjacent to it." A pause. "He had access to our movement schedule." Ellison did not move. "You think he compromised your mission?" "I think it's possible. I thought it was possible 7 years ago. I couldn't prove it. I still can't." He looked at her. "But Rourke Danner showing up here, connected to a technology company where I happen to work, on the night classified defense material goes missing. That's not a coincidence I'm comfortable explaining away." "Neither am I." Ellison pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. For the first time, something in her posture shifted from investigator to something more human. "You understand what I'm going to have to do with this information. You're going to pull my sealed record. Yes. And then the people in that room are going to look at me differently. Yes." She didn't apologize for it. He appreciated that. "Okay," he said. She nodded once and stood. Then at the door she paused. "The video. Celeste Arden's 11 words. You were analyzing them." "I was listening to them." "Did you get anything?" He thought about what he'd gotten. The rhythm, the construction, the 3 letters that kept reassembling themselves into the same shape. W. T. N. What they need. Northwatch. She was trying to communicate something, he said. I need to hear the audio file again, cleaner, and I need to see the full schematic of Northwatch's subsurface layout. Ellison looked at him for a moment. You understand that even if you're right about Northwatch, a federal tactical team would need— I know the timelines, Elias said. How long to mobilize a full tactical response to a decommissioned facility with unknown interior configuration and potentially armed multiple threat occupants? She didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. They have 6 hours, he said, from the video timestamp. It's been almost 2 hours already. I know the math. Then you know whether the timeline works. She held his gaze. It's tight. It doesn't work, he said. Not harsh, just flat. Not for a full team. Not with the briefing time and staging required. He stood up. I've been inside Northwatch. I know its subsurface layout better than anything you'd find in a current federal database because the last survey was done in 2008, and the facility had significant modifications before closure. He paused. I'm not telling you I should run a solo extraction. I'm telling you I have information that changes the response calculus. Ellison opened the door. In the corridor, someone was moving fast with a tablet, the blue jacket FBI man speaking rapidly into a phone. The room at the end of the hall had gotten louder. Come back in with me, she said, and let me open your record before we go any further. The room went quiet when Ellison called up the file on the conference room wall screen, and it stayed quiet while people read it. Elias sat near the back and did not watch the screen. He had read the file himself, once, a long time ago. The after-action language, the careful bureaucratic accounting of catastrophe, the formal citation language that described what he had done before everything went wrong in terms that were technically accurate and experientially hollow. He watched people's faces instead. Dana Solt from corporate security looked surprised and then uncomfortable. Detective Huang went very still. Two of the federal agents traded a look that was not quite respect, but was a recalibration of the kind Elias had seen before. People adjusting their model of a person when the model turned out to be missing significant information. The blue jacket FBI man, whose name turned out to be Calloway, said, You were at Northwatch Station. When? 2 training rotations, 2009 and 2010. The second was an extended joint exercise, 3 weeks. I know the facility's maintenance tunnel system, the subterranean B-level layout, and the utility corridor that runs beneath the old training barracks. He paused. There are sections of the facility that were constructed off the official blueprints, overflow editions. They won't appear in any database you can currently access. Calloway looked at Ellison. We can't authorize a civilian. I'm not asking for authorization, Elias said. I'm offering information. What you do with it is your decision. Calloway's jaw tightened. He was not a man who enjoyed being redirected. Agent Calloway, Ellison said, with the specific tone of someone concluding a sub-discussion, and Calloway went quiet. Elias's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Mrs. Galvez, 3:14 a.m. His stomach lurched. He stood and walked quickly to the corridor, answered. Mrs. Galvez, I'm sorry to call this late, honey. Nora had a nightmare and she's asking for you. Mrs. Galvez's voice was thick with interrupted sleep, but calm enough. She's not crying. She wants to know you're okay. I think she could hear me on the phone or something. Elias exhaled. The breath went all the way down. Put her on. A moment of shuffling, then Nora's voice, small and still blurred at the edges with sleep. Dad? Hey, Bug, I'm here. Where are you? At work. Something came up. He kept his voice the same as it always was. He had learned that children heard the texture of a voice more accurately than they heard words. You have a bad dream? There were loud noises in it. A pause. Are you coming home? Not yet, but soon. He leans against the corridor wall, one hand flat on the cool surface. Go back to sleep. Mrs. Galvez will stay. She snores. I know. Pretend it's thunder. Short pause, then quietly. Okay. Good girl. I love you. Love you, Dad. He hung up. He stood in the corridor for 3 seconds with his hand still on the wall. Then he went back into the room. Well, at 3:41 a.m., Ellison confirmed Northwatch Station as the primary search location based on cross-referencing Elias's analysis. An independent signal trace from the video file's background frequency signature and a satellite thermal pass of the northeastern corridor that showed anomalous power draw activity at a supposedly offline facility. It was not a clean confirmation. The satellite data was ambiguous enough that Callaway argued against it for 11 minutes. The frequency analysis was preliminary and could have had alternate explanations. But the clay soil, the construction type, the geographic corridor, and the power signature all pointed in the same direction, and the math of the timeline was what it was. A federal tactical team began staging. Estimated deployment, 90 minutes to full operational readiness, given the facility's remote location and unknown interior risk profile. The 6-hour clock had 4 hours and 9 minutes remaining when they started staging, which meant the team's arrival window would be inside the deadline, but barely, and with no margin for the kind of complications that abandoned military facilities reliably produced. Ellison knew that. Elias could see it in the set of her shoulders when she looked at the timeline board. He also knew something else. The video's background, in the upper left corner, the concrete ceiling with the wire reinforcement, had a very specific shadow pattern created by a light source positioned low and to the right. That light positioning, combined with the room's proportions visible in the footage, matched one space in Northwatch's subsurface B level with considerable precision. Room 39, a former communications holding room, off the main corridor, accessible through a ventilation access shaft from the maintenance tunnel that ran under the northeast quadrant of the facility. The shaft existed because a former base commander had it built during a renovation in 2007, and it did not appear on the original facility blueprints. It appeared on the updated maintenance survey from 2009, which Elias had read during his first training rotation, because he had been the kind of officer who read facility surveys when he was given facility surveys. He had not told Ellison about the shaft yet, not because he was withholding it. He had told himself he was not withholding it, but because there was a conversation that had to happen before he told her, and he was still deciding whether he was ready to have it, because telling her about the shaft meant telling her how he planned to use it, and he wasn't sure he was the man who did things like that anymore. He had spent 7 years being very certain that he wasn't. Nora's face was fresh in his memory, her voice soft with sleep, asking when he was coming home. He sat at the conference table with a cup of coffee someone had left untouched, gone cold now, and stared at the map of the northeastern corridor on the wall screen. 4 hours. Roughly. Somewhere in room 39 of Northwatch Station, a woman who had once spent 30 seconds defending a man she didn't know was sitting in a metal chair with her wrists bound and a cut above her eyebrow, and she had looked directly into the camera and found a way, even terrified and in pain, and with a mercenary standing 2 feet away, to embed a signal in 11 words because she was still fighting, still thinking, still trying to give someone a map home. The coffee had gone cold. The clock on the wall read 3:52 a.m. Victor Say, Aegis Meridian's head of physical security, a compact, quiet man of about 50 who had said almost nothing during the past 3 hours, but had been paying attention to everything, moved to stand beside Elias without quite making it obvious that's what he was doing. "You know the inside of that facility," Victor said. Low. Not quite a question. "I've been there." Victor was quiet for a moment. He had the specific quality of a man who had done serious work in his life and no longer needed to announce it. "I know a maintenance access point on the facility's eastern perimeter," he said. "It's not on any current map." Elias looked at him. "I did a site survey in 2012, Victor said, when we were evaluating it as a potential secondary data storage site for Aegis. The deal fell through, but I did the full walkthrough." He paused. "There's a tunnel access point under the eastern fence line. Maintenance infrastructure that was never decommissioned because nobody bothered." "I know the tunnel," Elias said. Victor looked at him directly. "I figured you did." They held the look for a moment. 2 men who had, each in different ways, spent their lives being useful in situations where usefulness was not comfortable. "The federal team needs 90 minutes to stage," Elias said quietly. "I know." "The timeline, I know the timeline." Elias turned back to the map. His hands were on the table in front of him, flat. They were steady. They had always been steady when it mattered, which he had never fully decided whether to consider a gift or a curse. He thought about Nora. "I thought about 3 men who had died in a cold place 7 years ago while he made decisions based on intelligence that someone had deliberately poisoned." He thought about a pen on a concrete floor, pointing east. I need to tell Agent Ellison something, he said. I'll be here when you're done, Victor said, and walked to the window and looked out at the city going gray with early morning. Elias stood up. He had made decisions like this before. Not this exact decision, but this kind. The kind where you knew the cost before you agreed to pay it. And the question wasn't whether you could afford it, but whether you could live with not paying. He picked up the cold coffee, took a drink, set it back down. Then he walked across the room to find Ellison, and this time when she looked at him, he was ready to open all the doors. Ellison listened without interrupting, which was a discipline Elias had learned to recognize as rarer than it should have been. He told her about room 39, about the ventilation shaft, about the maintenance survey from 2009, and why he was confident the shaft still existed and was still passable. He told her about the shadow pattern in the video, the low right light source, the room proportions, the match. He laid it out the way he had been trained to lay out intelligence assessments, sequentially, specifically, without editorializing, letting the data carry its own weight. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You've been sitting on the shaft since you identified room 39, she said. I've been deciding what to do with it. And now you've decided. I've decided you need to know about it. He paused. What happens next is your call. Ellison looked at the map on the wall screen, then back at him. The room around them had the particular charged stillness of a space where everyone was pretending not to listen. If you go in through the maintenance tunnel before the tactical team is in position, she said, you're operating without federal sanction, without backup, without... Victor Say will be with me. Victor Say is a corporate security director. He's not... He did 2 years force recon before going private sector, Elias said. He hasn't told anyone here that, but I've been watching him work a room for the last 3 hours. He met her eyes. He's solid. Ellison pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. It was the first gesture she'd made all night that acknowledged the actual weight of what was happening. If you go in and it goes wrong, she said, I cannot help you, officially. I know. If it goes right, she stopped, started again. The tactical team needs to be moving simultaneously, not staged behind you. Agreed. I'm not asking them to wait on us. I'm asking them to move on their timeline and let us move on ours. You'll have comms. If you can get me a secure channel. She looked at him for a long moment. Not the way she'd been looking at him earlier, assessing and recalculating, but something more direct than that. Something that acknowledged the fact that she was about to authorize something she couldn't officially authorize, and they both knew it, and the math of the situation was what it was. There are 4 hours and 40 minutes on that clock, she said. I need you back out with her before the tactical team breaches, or the entry turns into a crossfire situation. She stood. Do not let it become a crossfire situation. Understood. Varden. She stopped him with the word before he could move. Whatever happened 7 years ago, whatever you're carrying from that mission, I need you functional tonight. Not heroic, functional. Her eyes were steady. Can you do that? He thought briefly of Nora's voice on the phone. Are you coming home? He thought of the pen on the concrete floor. Yes, he said. The conversation with Calloway took 7 minutes and ended with Calloway making it explicitly clear that he was not authorizing anything, and that any action taken outside the federal team's operational scope was entirely the individual's own responsibility, which was the specific legal language that meant yes, but nothing in writing. Elias had heard variations of it before and understood it for what it was. Victor had 2 sets of tactical gear in the trunk of his personal vehicle, not department issue, private procurement, the kind of quiet professional habit that corporate security veterans developed in cities where the gap between official response and actual need had a way of becoming personally relevant. He did not comment on the coincidence of having it. Elias did not ask. They suited up in the parking structure of a closed pharmacy 2 blocks from the Aegis Meridian building at 4:17 a.m., moving with the particular economy of men who had done this before in different contexts and didn't need to narrate it. Elias checked his radio earpiece twice. Victor ran a quick function test on the tactical light he'd attached to his jacket. You said you know the maintenance tunnel, Victor said. End to end? End to end as of 2010. I'm assuming no structural changes. The facility's been officially closed for 13 years, and significant modification would have shown on the thermal. Assuming. Yes. Elias was honest about it. There's a section under the northeast quadrant where I lost my map detail. About 60 feet of tunnel I only traversed once, at night, in training that wasn't focused on navigation. He looked at Victor. I'll know it when we're in it. Victor nodded. He did not seem troubled by this. It was, Elias reflected, one of the useful things about working alongside someone who had actually done difficult things under imperfect conditions. They didn't expect the conditions to be perfect. They drove east in Victor's car, no conversation, the city thinning out around them as they moved from commercial corridors into industrial flats, and then into the unmanaged rural margin where the northeastern county gave way to scrubland, and the occasional remnant of what had once been a more significant military presence in the region. The reddish clay that lined the roadside confirmed the soil composition. Elias noted it without comment. At 4:49 a.m., they pulled off the main road onto a service track that hadn't been maintained recently enough to be comfortable, and Victor drove it anyway, headlights off, using the green-tinted scope he'd mounted on the dashboard. Fence line is 300 meters ahead, Victor said. Eastern access. I know. You want to talk through entry? Not particularly. Victor smiled, just slightly, at the windshield. Fair enough. Look, the fence line at Northwatch Station's eastern perimeter was 8 feet of chain link topped with old barbed wire that had oxidized to a reddish brown in the years since the facility's closure. It had the look of infrastructure that was maintained just barely enough to constitute a legal barrier, which told Elias something about the kidnappers' preparation. They hadn't needed to breach the perimeter on this side. They had come in another way. Victor found the maintenance access hatch 11 meters south of the point Elias had estimated, which was close enough. It was a steel plate flush with the ground, hinged on the south side, secured with a padlock that had been cut at some point and replaced with a piece of wire, not recently, from the corrosion on the wire, by persons unknown for reasons that were now irrelevant. Elias pulled the hatch up. The tunnel below exhaled stale air that smelled of old concrete and something electrical, faint and acrid, like dormant wiring that had gotten damp. He dropped in first, landing on a dirt floor that compressed slightly under his weight, and moved sideways to give Victor room to follow. Inside the tunnel, darkness, a ceiling that cleared his head by about 4 inches, and the sound of nothing, which was itself information. No ventilation running, no active systems. The facility's power draw that the satellite had detected was not coming from this quadrant. They moved east. The tunnel was not a clean thing. It was narrow and low, and the floor was uneven, where frost heave had lifted sections of the concrete underlayer over the years. And there were 2 points where they had to move past collapsed ceiling sections that had dropped enough debris to require careful navigation without kicking loose rock that would make noise. It was dark enough that Elias moved by a combination of memory and the careful forward extension of his left hand along the tunnel wall, counting the irregularities. 2 pipe joints, 1 recessed access panel, the old electrical conduit bracket that told him where he was. Victor moved behind him in silence, maintaining exactly the right distance, neither crowding nor falling back. He had done this before. The certainty of it was steady and useful. The junction came at approximately 400 feet in, a T-intersection where the main tunnel split north and south into the facility's subterranean infrastructure. Elias stopped, pressed his back to the wall, and listened for 30 seconds. From the north branch, nothing. From the south branch, a very faint, low-frequency hum. Not mechanical, human. Voices. Multiple, indistinct at this distance, but present. Elias tapped Victor's arm twice. Victor heard it. They went south. The south branch ran for approximately 200 feet before it met the base of the ventilation shaft access, exactly where Elias had placed it in his memory. The shaft was a 40-degree diagonal climb of roughly 30 feet, constructed with handholds cut into the concrete on either side. Standard military installation, intended for maintenance workers, not for speed. The handholds were corroded but solid. Elias went up first, slowly, testing each grip before committing weight, and tried not to think about the fact that he was 40 pounds heavier than he'd been during training and that his left shoulder had an old impingement injury that didn't love this angle. It didn't love it. He went up anyway. At the top, a vent panel. 4 screws, Phillips head, the kind of detail that only mattered if you didn't have a screwdriver. Victor had one. Of course he had one. Elias held the panel while Victor removed the screws from below, and then he lifted it clear and set it against the shaft wall, and looked through the opening into the room beyond. Room 39. He recognized it immediately. The dimensions, the poured concrete, the specific shadow of the low-mounted work light in the far corner that he had identified from the video. What he had not been able to determine from the video was who else was in the room. 2 guards, positioned near the door on the north wall. They were armed, sidearms, visible, and they were both looking at their phones, which was a professional failure so common that Elias had stopped being surprised by it years ago. People with phones became people with divided attention, and divided attention had a way of creating options. Celeste was in the center of the room, in the metal chair, her wrists still bound behind her. She had her head down, chin toward her chest. At first his stomach tightened with the thought that she was unconscious, but then he watched the particular stillness of her and understood it. She was conserving, keeping herself together, managing her fear in the specific way that people with genuine discipline managed it, which was not by fighting it, but by sitting very still inside it and not letting it run the body. She was awake. She was present. Elias lowered himself from the shaft opening to the floor of the room in one movement, pushing down with both arms, landing on the balls of his feet. The sound was less than a footstep. Both guards continued looking at their phones. He crossed 7 feet in 3 seconds. The first guard went down before he finished turning, a controlled strike to the back of the neck at the base of the skull. Not killing, not meant to, but fast and certain and complete. The man folded without making a sound that mattered. The second guard heard the first man go down and started to stand, and got one hand on his sidearm before Elias was already past the draw. Left hand on the gun wrist, turning it out, right elbow to the jaw, controlled, angled down, and the man sat back hard into the wall and did not get back up. 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Victor dropped from the shaft behind him and checked the door. Elias turned to Celeste. She was staring at him. Her eyes were open and completely alert. Whatever she'd been conserving behind that stillness had snapped fully online the moment she heard movement, and she was looking at him with the specific expression of a person whose brain was processing something that didn't fit any category she had available. He crouched in front of her and pulled his knife. "Don't move," he said quietly. "You—" Her voice was rough, dry. She stopped. Tried again. "You're the janitor." "Yes." He cut the zip ties at her wrists. Her arms came forward slowly, stiffly, and she made a small involuntary sound at the return of circulation that she immediately pressed her lips together to suppress. "Can you stand?" "Yes." She stood and nearly proved herself wrong. He caught her arm, not grabbing, just steadying, and she found her balance in a moment and straightened. She had blood dried at the corner of her mouth that he hadn't seen in the video, and her right eye had the beginning of bruising around the socket. Someone had hit her at some point since the video was recorded. The knowledge of that settled into Elias's chest with a cold, heavy precision that he recognized and set aside. Later. "We need to move," he said. "The ventilation shaft. Can you—" "I can climb." Her voice was flat and certain. She looked past him at Victor. "Who's he?" "Victor Say, your head of physical security." Something shifted in her expression. Recognition, and then something more complicated. "Victor." "Ms. Arden," Victor said from the door, low and controlled, and the professionalism in his voice was genuine rather than performed. "We need to go." "Wait." Celeste was looking at the guards, at the room, at the one small camera in the upper corner that Elias had clocked when he came in, and that was currently showing a looping feed. Someone had noticed it before they entered, which meant Ellison's team had been working the facility's surveillance network from the outside. "There's a data drive," she said. "Rourke has it. It contains the complete extraction of Aegis Meridian's classified server architecture. If he gets out with that, that's a federal problem," Elias said. "Right now our problem is getting you out." "It's the same problem." Her voice was not loud, but it had the quality of someone who was used to being heard when they spoke and intended to continue being heard. "If that drive leaves this facility, it doesn't matter that I'm safe. The technology on it represents $3 billion of defense development, and it will be on the market within 72 hours. She looked at him directly. "You understand what that means?" He did. That was the irritating thing. "The drive is with Rourke. Where is he?" "The operations room, upper level, northwest corner. He's been running communications from there." She paused. There are at least 6 more men in this facility. I've been counting footsteps and voices for 6 hours. Elias looked at Victor. Victor made a small gesture with his chin. Your call. The federal team is staged and moving, Elias said to Celeste. They breached the main entrance in approximately 70 minutes. If Rourke has what he needs and decides to move early, he's waiting on a confirmation signal from inside Aegis Meridian, Celeste said. He needs someone at the company to authorize a final credential transfer before the drive is complete. Without that confirmation, the drive is only partially loaded. She paused. He gave them a deadline. He told them 2 hours from the video. Elias went still. That deadline has passed. I know. Her voice didn't waver. Whoever his contact is inside the company didn't deliver. That's why I've been hearing shouting from the upper level for the last 20 minutes. He looked at her for a moment, then at Victor. How current is your knowledge of this facility's upper-level layout? My site survey covered the full structure, Victor said, including the Northwest Ops Room. It has 2 entry points, the main corridor door and a secondary fire exit that opens onto the exterior loading dock. He paused. The loading dock is where they staged the vehicles, which meant if Rourke was preparing to move, the loading dock was where he'd go. Elias made the calculation in less than 3 seconds. It was not a calculation he liked because none of the variables were clean, and 2 of them involved taking a woman who had been in captivity for 6 hours into the upper level of an active hostile facility instead of extracting her through a maintenance shaft. But the math of the drive was real, and Celeste had done this, had spent 6 hours in a metal chair counting footsteps and voices and measuring time, still fighting, still mapping, and she was still standing. You stay behind me, he said. You do exactly what I say, when I say it, without asking why. If I tell you to get down, you're already down. If I tell you to run, you run, and you don't look back. She looked at him steadily. Agreed. If at any point I determine the risk has shifted past what I can manage, I'm getting you out through the shaft, and the drive is Ellison's problem. Agreed, she said again. No hesitation. He nodded once and turned to the shaft. Victor takes point on the upper level. I cover the rear. I know the layout, Victor said. Follow me when we're up. So, what had made Elias effective as a SEAL? Not just technically competent, but effective. The thing his commanding officer had noted in review after review with the specific language situational absorption was that he did not lose track of the whole picture while managing individual problems. Other operators occasionally got consumed by the immediate tactical moment. Elias had always maintained a second layer of awareness running underneath the primary action, tracking the larger environment while his hands and body dealt with what was in front of them. That layer was running now, and it was telling him things. The facility's noise profile had changed since they dropped into the maintenance tunnel. The indistinct voices from earlier had reorganized. Fewer sources, closer together, the specific acoustic quality of people converging on a central point rather than distributing across a space. That meant consolidation. Consolidation at this hour, in a facility running an operation that had already gone partially wrong, meant preparation to move. Rourke was getting ready to leave. They came up through a secondary stairwell access that Victor knew and Elias didn't, emerging into a service corridor on the facility's upper level that smelled of old industrial lubricant and had a strip of yellow emergency lighting along the baseboards that provided just enough visibility to navigate without light of their own. The Northwest Ops Room was 40 meters ahead and to the left. Between them and it, 2 men in the corridor, both armed, neither of them in a position that suggested high alert. They were standing, not posted, which meant their mental posture was transition mode, waiting for orders to move rather than actively defending the position. Victor took the closer man. Elias took the far one. It was messy in the way real things were always messy. The far guard was faster to respond than Elias had clocked him, got one shout out before Elias covered the distance and cut it off. And the shout was short and sharp, and probably heard by someone. They had seconds now, not minutes. Victor was already at the ops room door. It's going to be locked, Celeste said from directly behind Elias. I know. Victor stepped aside and Elias hit the door at the handle with the flat of his boot, once, hard, using his heel and his full body weight in the way a door needed to be hit when you didn't have time to be precise about it. The frame cracked. He hit it again. It came open. The ops room was the size of a large office. 8 men inside it, which was more than Elias had wanted, and a table in the center covered in laptops and communications equipment, and Rourke Danner standing at the far end with a laptop in his hand and an expression on his face that moved through surprise and into something colder in about half a second. He had two men between himself and the door who reacted immediately. The next 40 seconds were not clean and would not have looked clean from any angle. Victor was in the room fast, moving left while Elias went right, and the specific thing that made it survivable was not precision, but the fact that the room was full of people who had been preparing to flee rather than fight. And the transition between those two states takes time that Elias and Victor spent not giving them. Two men went down. A third slammed Elias into the wall hard enough to ring his vision, and he got a hand on the man's collar and used the wall as a third point. Body into the corner, arm around the throat, controlled pressure until the man's legs went uncertain and then stopped. His left shoulder screamed at the impact angle, and he felt the familiar grinding of the impingement and pushed past it, which was the only thing to do with it in the moment. Rourke used the chaos to move for the fire exit. "He's going for the dock," Victor called. Elias was already moving. He cleared two more men, one who swung at him, one who was smart enough to step back against the wall and choose not to, and came through the fire exit onto the loading dock at a dead run. The dock was a concrete platform with a corrugated metal roof and two vehicles, a black panel van and a gray SUV. And Rourke was halfway to the SUV with the laptop tucked under his arm, moving faster than a heavy-set man his age should have been able to move. And Elias knew from the way he moved that this was not surprise. Rourke had known there was a possibility of this. The SUV's driver was already in the vehicle, engine running. Elias covered the distance at full sprint and hit Rourke from behind, both of them going down hard onto the loading dock surface. Concrete taking skin off Elias's forearm through the jacket, where the sleeve had ridden up. The laptop skidding clear across the dock and stopping against the wheel of the van. Rourke was strong and trained and furious, and he fought back with the specific ferocity of a man who understood what was at stake for him personally, which made him dangerous in a way that pure professional aggression sometimes wasn't. He got an elbow into Elias's ribs that found something soft, and his knee into the side of Elias's thigh, and for a moment they were tangled in the way serious fights got tangled. Not clean, not cinematic, just two men on concrete, each trying to impose a solution on a situation that didn't want one imposed. Rourke got a hand free and went for Elias's throat. "Marcus," Rourke said, and the use of the name, the wrong name, the team name from 7 years ago, hit Elias somewhere specific and deliberate. "How many men did we lose in Kandahar, remember?" Elias did remember. He remembered every specific detail. He remembered the names. "You want to know who gave the coordinates?" Rourke's voice was strained with exertion, but he was using it as a weapon, and he knew exactly where to aim it. "You want to know if it was me? You've been wondering that for 7 years, haven't you? You could find out right now. Let me up and I'll tell you." Elias looked at him. He felt the pull of it, 7 years of it, the specific gravity of wanting to know. 3 men. 3 men who had trusted him. 3 families who had received the notifications. 7 years of carrying something that might have been his fault or might have been somebody else's and not being able to determine which. He looked at Rourke's face and saw, under the aggression and the calculated manipulation, the particular expression of a man who was gambling, who was using the unknown as a lever because it was the only one he had left. "No," Elias said. He flipped Rourke face down and wrenched the man's arms behind his back, and Rourke stopped talking and started swearing instead, which was a different thing and much less complicated. "Driver," Elias called, "turn the engine off. Hands on the dashboard." A pause. "Now." A long beat from inside the SUV, then the engine died. Victor came through the fire exit with 3 of the ops room men zip-tied together, which was efficient enough that Elias made a note to ask him when he had time. Celeste came behind him, moving carefully, favoring her left side in a way that was new. Someone had gotten to her ribs at some point, and she hadn't mentioned it. She would not have mentioned it. She looked at Rourke on the ground. She looked at Elias. "The drive's in the laptop," she said. "Inside the case." "Get it," Elias said. "Don't touch the actual drive casing. Ellison will want clean evidence." Celeste crossed to the van, retrieved the laptop, and held it in both hands with the expression of someone who had spent 6 hours not knowing if she was going to get to hold anything again and was aware of that fact without being willing to put words to it. Victor had Rourke on his feet. Rourke's face was bleeding from where it had met the dock surface, and his breathing was hard, and he looked at Elias with an expression that had moved past anger into something more calculated and less readable. "This isn't over," Rourke said. "It is for tonight," Elias said. He pulled the radio from his jacket. "Ellison, we have Arden, we have the drive. Rourke Danner is in custody, loading dock, eastern exterior. We need the team at the dock. There are 5 men in the ops room that need collection." He paused. "We're all on our feet." Ellison's voice came back in approximately 4 seconds. "Copy. Team is 6 minutes out. Stay on position." Elias lowered the radio. Around them, the loading dock was still and cold in the pre-dawn air, the sky to the east beginning to show the first suggestion of lighter gray at the very edge of the horizon. Not dawn, not yet, but the direction of it, the indication that it was coming. Rourke sat on the dock edge, Victor's hand on his shoulder, and said nothing. Celeste stood a few feet from Elias with the laptop held against her chest and did not look at Rourke. She looked at the sky. Then she looked at Elias with the specific directness she'd had in the video, in the lobby, in every interaction he'd observed, the same expression that did not flinch from what it was looking at. "You knew this facility," she said. "Yes." "Before tonight?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, processing. "The pen," she said. "In the garage. You found it." "Yes." "I wasn't sure anyone would." Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not quite the specific tremor of a person who had been holding an enormous weight and was only now, with it lifted, feeling how heavy it had been. "I didn't know if it would be enough." "It was enough," he said. She nodded. Once, and then she pressed the laptop a little tighter against her chest and looked back at the eastern sky, and Elias looked with her, and they stood like that in the cold air of the loading dock until the first federal vehicles came down the service road with their lights cutting through the gray dark. But then, from the far end of the dock, a second fire exit that none of them had been watching came open, and a different man stepped through it with a gun already raised, and the night, which Elias had allowed himself for exactly 30 seconds to believe was over, was not over yet. Gavin Strake, Celeste's chief operating officer, looked at the scene in front of him. Rourke cuffed, the ops room men restrained, federal lights coming down the road, and his face moved through a sequence of expressions that ended somewhere past desperation and arrived at a place that was much more dangerous. His gun was pointed at Celeste. "Give me the laptop," he said, "and a vehicle, right now." Nobody moved. The federal lights were still coming down the service road, a quarter-mile out, maybe less, and the sound of tires on gravel was audible in the cold air, and none of that changed the immediate geometry of the loading dock, which was a man with a gun pointed at Celeste Arden's center mass from a distance of 12 feet, which was close enough that missing was not a realistic possibility and far enough that closing it without a clear opening would end badly. Elias had his sidearm. Victor had his. Neither of them had a shot. Gavin Strake had positioned himself with his back to the facility wall and Celeste between himself and both of them, and the positioning was not accidental. Whatever else Gavin was, he had thought about this moment. He had planned for the possibility of it. Elias registered all of this in the first 2 seconds and spent the next 2 seconds registering Gavin himself, the man's face, his hands, the specific quality of his fear. Because Gavin was afraid. That was visible and important. His breathing was audible at 12 feet, his jaw was tight enough to whiten the skin at the hinge, and his gun hand had a tremor in it that was not from cold. Afraid people with guns were more dangerous than calm people with guns in certain configurations, and this was one of those configurations because afraid people made lateral decisions, sudden, non-strategic moves driven by the part of the brain that had stopped doing math and started doing panic. "Gavin," Celeste said. Her voice was extraordinary under the circumstances. Not loud, not placating, not the voice of a woman with a gun pointed at her. Just her name for him, and the steadiness of it seemed to actually land on him, made him blink. "Laptop," he said, "and a vehicle. I'm not... This doesn't have to..." He stopped, reorganized. "Give me the laptop." "Gavin, look at the road," Celeste said. "Look at the lights. There's nowhere to go." The laptop buys me somewhere to go. It buys me time. It buys me, just give me the laptop. Elias was watching Gavin's eyes. The eyes were the problem. They were moving too fast. Celeste, the road, Victor, Elias, the restrained men on the dock, back to Celeste. And the speed of the movement was the visual register of a man whose decision-making had fractured into multiple competing impulses and hadn't resolved yet. That was a window, but it was a narrow one, and it was closing as Gavin's fear calcified into something more rigid. Victor had shifted his weight almost imperceptibly to the left. 2 inches, maybe 3. Elias clocked it without looking at him directly. Victor was angling for a position that would split Gavin's attention, which was the right instinct but required coordination, or it would just make Gavin's trigger finger solve the problem for him. Elias needed Gavin looking at him, not at Celeste. "You were the inside contact," Elias said. Not loud. Conversational, almost. Rourke needed someone inside Aegis with administrative credentials. You had them. He kept his own body still, his hands visible, his gun lowered. Not put away, but angled down, the posture of a man choosing de-escalation as a tactic rather than a surrender. But the credential transfer tonight didn't go through. That's why you're here instead of somewhere else. Gavin's eyes snapped to him. Good. You tried to authorize the transfer and something stopped you, Elias continued. Federal monitoring on the server, maybe, or you got cold feet. A pause. Or Celeste had a dead man protocol built into the architecture that her own COO didn't know about. Celeste said nothing, but the slight shift in her posture told Elias he'd guessed right. Gavin's gun hand moved, not toward Celeste, but slightly away, a fractional redirection that wasn't conscious. His eyes had locked onto Elias with the specific intensity of a man who needed to argue with someone, and Elias had just given him a reason to argue. She built it without telling me, Gavin said, and the bitterness in his voice was so raw, it was almost startling. Not the voice of a calculated criminal in the final stage of a plan. The voice of a man who had wanted something and been denied it and couldn't fully believe it had happened. 15 years, I built half of what this company is, and she put a lockout in the core architecture and didn't... He stopped. His jaw tightened again. You've been selling the technology for how long? Elias asked. That's none of... 3 years? 4? Elias kept his voice level. He was not interrogating. He was talking, filling the air, keeping Gavin's brain occupied with language so the other part of it had less bandwidth to spend on the gun. You watch people below, you get promoted, get bonuses, get credit for work that ran through your division, and the company kept growing, but your piece of it didn't feel like enough. Don't... Gavin's voice cracked at the edge. Don't make it sound like I'm... This is not a... He exhaled hard through his nose. You don't understand anything about what I built for that company. I understand you're going to prison regardless of what happens in the next 30 seconds, Elias said. The question is what else happens. The federal vehicles were at the dock's access road now, headlights turning the corrugated metal overhead orange and white. Doors opening. Voices, organized and purposeful, the sound of a tactical team deploying. Gavin heard it, and his face did something terrible, a compression of all the remaining options into a single desperate moment. And his gun came up fully, no longer the trembling intermediate angle, but direct and intentional, and he said, "The laptop. Now. I will..." He hit a button on the panel behind him. The sound that followed was low and mechanical, a deep, resonant thump from somewhere in the facility's infrastructure, followed immediately by a recorded voice through the building's PA system. Old speakers. The audio quality degraded by years of disuse, but the words were clear enough. Demolition sequence initiated. Facility evacuation required. Time to detonation, 5 minutes. The voice repeated, 5 minutes. The loading dock, for one frozen second, was entirely silent. Then Rourke said, from the dock edge where Victor still had a hand on his shoulder, "You're an idiot, Gavin. Shut up." Gavin's voice had taken on a different quality, higher, faster, the specific register of someone who had made a decision before fully calculating its implications, and was now processing the calculation in real time. I built this in as a contingency. If the operation failed, the facility goes. Nobody gets the drive, nobody gets Rourke's communications, nobody gets you either, Victor said. I can get out before... Gavin looked at the road. The federal agents were visible now, 4 of them at the dock's lower ramp, weapons up, taking in the scene. Federal agents, one of them called. Everybody freeze. Everything on the loading dock held that position for a moment. Agents at the ramp, Gavin against the wall with his gun on Celeste, Victor and Elias on opposite sides, Rourke zip-tied on the dock edge, the 5 restrained ops room men in a row. 4 minutes, 40 seconds. Elias spoke quietly, not to Gavin. Celeste. She was looking at him. Had been looking at him since the demolition sequence started, the way she'd been looking at him in room 39 when he came through the ventilation shaft. That same expression of a person processing information rapidly and waiting for the configuration to resolve into something actionable. The facility's demolition system, he said, still quiet, still conversational. Old military install. What year was the construction completed? She understood immediately why he was asking, because she had spent 6 hours memorizing everything she could about this facility. Structural phase was 1991. Control systems updated in 2003. 2003. That narrowed it. Pre-digital integration, post-analog baseline. A specific generation of military demolition control architecture that Elias knew, because it was the same generation that had been in use at 3 facilities he had operated in during his SEAL years, and those systems had a characteristic that newer systems didn't. They could be aborted at the physical control panel, not remotely, not through software. Physically, a manual cutoff circuit behind the primary control board, accessible through the panel housing, designed as a fail-safe against false triggers and accidental activation. The panel was in the facility's operations room, which was 40 meters back through the fire exit and down a corridor. 4 minutes, 15 seconds. Gavin's attention had fractured again. Elias, the agents at the ramp, the PA system still cycling its warning. The gun was still raised, but the geometry had softened. The direction of his gaze pulled in too many directions. Victor was 2 feet closer to Gavin than he'd been 30 seconds ago. The 2 inches had become 24 through a series of completely undetectable shifts, the specific patience of a man who had learned that distance reduced itself if you were willing to wait and move with the same care you'd use approaching something that startled easily. Elias caught Victor's eye for half a second. Victor gave the smallest nod imaginable. Elias raised his voice just enough for the agents at the ramp. The facility has a demolition system running. 4 minutes. The abort panel is in the northwest ops room. I need to get back inside. The lead agent, a woman, compact, her weapon tracking Gavin, said, "Nobody moves until—" 4 minutes is not enough time for a negotiation, Elias said. Someone needs to go to the abort panel right now. He looked at Gavin. Tell them how to shut it off. Gavin shook his head, short and rigid. Then I need to go do it myself. He took 1 step toward the fire exit. Gavin swung the gun toward him. That was the opening. Victor moved. Not with the dramatic speed of an action sequence, but with the specific economy of a man who had calculated the distance precisely and spent 30 seconds closing it, 1 step, both hands on Gavin's gun arm, pulling it across the body so the barrel went wide, his shoulder driving into Gavin's upper chest, the wall doing the rest. The gun discharged once into the corrugated roof overhead, a sound like a hammer on sheet metal. And then Victor had the weapon and Gavin's arm was twisted up behind him, and Gavin was against the wall making a sound that was more humiliation than pain. Celeste had dropped the moment Victor moved, straight down, 1 knee on the concrete, the laptop clutched to her chest. She came back up immediately, already moving toward Elias. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. The ops room, she said. I know. They went through the fire exit together, the agents from the ramp coming in behind them, someone shouting coordination into a radio. The corridor was still dim, the emergency strip lighting at the baseboard throwing everything in that low amber yellow that flattened depth. The 2 men Elias had put down earlier were still down. The zip-tied ops room group was where Victor had left them, none of them trying anything now, the demolition announcement having apparently clarified everyone's priorities. The ops room itself was in chaos, the tables still covered in laptops, 2 screens still active, the remaining equipment knocked sideways from the earlier confrontation. The PA announcement cycled again as they entered. 3 minutes, 30 seconds. The primary control panel was on the north wall. A metal housing, institutional gray, standard military installation marking, in stenciled black letters that had faded but were still legible. Facility Systems Control. Authorized personnel only. It had a digital readout above it showing the countdown. 324. 323. Elias went to it. The housing was locked. A key cylinder, the kind that facilities kept on a master ring. But the lock was a standard barrel design from the early 2000s, and the panel itself was screwed to the wall with 4 Phillips head screws, and Victor had a screwdriver. Victor was not in the room. Victor was on the loading dock with Gavin. "Can you get it open?" Celeste asked. Elias looked at the panel, then at the tools on the table, so at the laptops, the cables, a metal equipment rack with exposed brackets. He pulled a bracket free from the rack, slid it into the gap between the panel housing and the wall, and applied lateral pressure. The housing was steel, but the wall mount was older than the housing, and the screws were corroded, and the third one pulled free under steady force, and the fourth pulled free when he repositioned the bracket lower. 258. The panel came open on its hinge. Behind it, a circuit board, a relay cluster, 3 switches and red protective covers, and on the lower right, behind a clear plastic safety panel secured with a simple quarter-turn latch, a single toggle switch with a yellow label that read, "Abort circuit, manual only." Celeste was reading the schematic mounted inside the panel housing. She was reading it fast, running her finger along the diagram without touching anything. "The abort circuit cuts the detonation signal," she said. "But if the sequence is past the intermediate confirmation point, the abort might only pause it, not cancel it." "How do I tell if it's past that point?" "The relay cluster, second row. If the middle indicator is red, we're past confirmation." Elias looked. Second row. Middle indicator, red, 231. "Pause or cancel?" he asked. "Pause resets to 40 seconds. It gives you one chance to input the override code to cancel fully. Without the code, at 40 seconds it resumes." "What's the code?" "I don't know." Her voice was even. She was not pretending this was fine. She was just not spending energy on what wasn't fine when there was still a problem to solve. Elias looked at the panel. The override code input was a 6-digit numeric keypad below the abort switch. Standard military system, 2003 vintage. He had seen this system before, not this facility, a different one, during a training rotation in 2010 at a facility that had since been converted. The trainer had been a Navy demolition specialist named Chief Petty Officer Dawes, who had the teaching habit of using real system codes as examples, and then saying, "Obviously don't use that in the field," in the specific tone of someone who found his own humor more amusing than anyone else did. Chief Dawes' go-to example code had been the facility number followed by the installation year, a combination he had called the laziest code the federal government ever authorized, and then laughed at his own joke for approximately 15 seconds. Northwatch Station. Facility designation NS7. Installation year 1991, 757991. 202. Elias flipped the abort toggle. The countdown display froze at 158, then reset upward to 040 and began counting down again. Celeste said nothing. She looked at the keypad. Elias typed 7, 5, 7, 9. 1. A half-second delay that felt much longer than a half-second. The display read, "Code accepted. Sequence canceled." The PA system went silent mid-announcement. The loading dock outside had gone very quiet. Elias stood in front of the panel with his hand still on the abort switch, and for a moment he just breathed. His shoulder was a sustained hot complaint. His forearm, where the concrete had taken the skin, was beginning to register in the specific delayed way that minor injuries registered when the adrenaline started to release. His hands were steady. They had been steady all the way through. He took them off the panel. Celeste was looking at him. In the quiet after the alarm, in the flat amber light of the ops room, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had been through something hard and was still standing, not because it hadn't been hard, but because standing was what she did. "That code," she said. "How did you know it?" "I didn't," he said. "I guessed." She looked at him for a moment with the expression she'd had on the loading dock, the one that was trying to put him in a category and not quite succeeding. "You guessed a 6-digit abort code with 90 seconds left." "I had context." He paused. "And the alternative was worse." She almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh. It came out as a short exhale with a different quality than the ones before it, something that acknowledged the absurdity of the last 6 hours in the only way available to a person who was still too tightly wound to fully process them. "Yes," she said. It was. The Federal Tactical Team completed their sweep of Northwatch Station in 48 minutes. They found 6 additional men in the facility's lower-level storage rooms. Rourke's operation had been larger than even Celeste's 6-hour headcount had captured, with a secondary crew that had been held in reserve on the lower level and had made the sound tactical decision, upon hearing the demolition alarm followed by sudden silence, followed by federal agents coming through every entry point simultaneously, to cooperate immediately and completely. Gavin Strake was in federal custody within 4 minutes of Victor putting him against the wall. He did not speak again on the loading dock. He did not look at Celeste when the agents walked him past. He looked at the ground with the expression of a man who had already begun the process of converting what he had done into something he could live with telling himself, which was going to be a long and unsuccessful project. Rourke Danner, despite the zip ties and the concrete dust on his face, and the calculation he'd been running all night, managed to be controlled and precise when the federal agents formally took him into custody. He walked with the bearing of a man who intended to be a problem in court, which he would be, and which was ultimately someone else's problem. As they walked him past Elias, he paused, just for a moment, the agent at his arm not immediately pulling him on, and looked at Elias with an expression that was not exactly readable. "Kandahar," Rourke said, just the word. Elias looked at him. "That's for a different conversation." Rourke studied him for a moment and then let the agent move him forward, and that was the last thing Rourke said on the loading dock, which was probably the smartest single decision he made all night. Ellison found Elias in the ops room 20 minutes later, sitting on an equipment case with his jacket off and his forearm resting on his knee. The concrete had taken a strip of skin about 3 inches long, and someone from the tactical team's medical kit had put a basic dressing on it, and he was sitting with the particular stillness of a man letting his body acknowledge the last several hours in the way bodies needed to when you stopped moving long enough to let them. She sat down across from him on an overturned equipment rack that was not designed for sitting and sat on it anyway. "The abort code," she said. "Lucky guess." "I already told the debrief team it was applied training knowledge," she said. "Which is close enough." She looked at him. "The drive is secure. Chain of custody is established. Rourke's communications equipment is being imaged. We have enough from what was on those servers to connect the full network, the shell companies, the buyers, the transfer history going back at least 4 years." She paused. "Gavin has already asked for a lawyer, which he's entitled to, and will not be discussing the weather with us until approximately 6 months from now, when his legal team realizes what the evidence looks like." "What does the evidence look like?" "Like a man who made very bad decisions over a long period of time and documented them thoroughly because he was arrogant enough to think the documentation would never be found." She looked at her hands briefly. "That's the thing about people who believe they're the smartest person in the room. They keep records." Elias said nothing. "There's something else," Ellison said. Her voice had changed slightly. Not softer, but more deliberate. The specific cadence of someone who was being careful about what they were about to say and how they were about to say it. "In Rourke's communications archive, there's a file." She paused. "It's heavily encrypted, but our team got into it inside the last hour. It contains operational communications from 7 years ago, a private channel between Rourke and at least 2 other parties." She met his eyes. "The communications detail the deliberate compromise of a SEAL team's movement schedule, coordinates pass to hostile forces, timing of the breach." She stopped. Elias was very still. "It's dated," she said. "Time-stamped. It predates your mission by 72 hours. She held his gaze. "Elias, it was Rourke. He compromised your mission. The intelligence failure wasn't yours. The ambush wasn't because of decisions you made." The ops room around them had its ambient noise, the federal agents moving through the facility, the distant sound of vehicles outside, the crackle of radios. The PA system was still silent. The countdown display above the control panel read, "Sequence canceled" in steady white letters. Elias looked at those letters for a moment. 7 years. 7 years of carrying it in the specific way you carried something you couldn't put down and couldn't hold comfortably. Always there, always the same weight, the same question without an answer. He had built an entire life around the carrying of it. Nora's childhood had been shaped, in ways she didn't know, and he had never examined too directly, by the weight of it. The protective distance he kept from anything that might require him to be the man he'd been, the tight radius of the life he'd constructed so that nothing could come close enough to break something else. 3 men, 3 families, 7 years of not knowing. He looked at the display. Sequence canceled. Okay, he said. It was not the response Ellison had expected. She waited, giving him space for whatever came next. I'm not... He stopped, tried again. I don't know what to do with that yet. I will eventually. He looked at her. But not tonight. She nodded once. There will be a formal review process. The record will be amended. It takes time, but it will happen. She stood, straightened her jacket. For tonight, it's enough that you know. He thought about that. About whether knowing was enough, when the knowing changed nothing about the 3 men or their families, or the 7 years already spent. The answer was complicated in ways he wasn't ready to navigate, but underneath the complication was something simple and stubborn. The truth was different from what he had been carrying, and different mattered, even when the weight didn't disappear immediately. Where's Celeste? He asked. Paramedics have her on the dock. The ribs are bruised, possibly cracked. She's being transported for imaging. She refused the transport for about 6 minutes and then agreed to it. A slight pause. She asked where you were before she agreed. Elias stood. His shoulder registered the movement with its full opinion. He put his jacket back on, carefully. He walked out through the fire exit onto the loading dock. The eastern sky was fully gray now, the color before the color of dawn, and the loading dock was bright with vehicle lights, and organized with the specific controlled energy of a federal scene being processed. The black panel van was being searched. The gray SUV had an agent with a camera photographing its interior. Rourke was in the back of a federal vehicle. Gavin was in another, further down the road. The paramedic unit was at the far end of the dock. Celeste was sitting on the back of it, a thermal blanket over her shoulders, letting a paramedic run a blood pressure cuff on her arm. She had her head up, watching the scene on the dock, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything. Not passively, not as a spectator, but with the specific attentiveness of a person who was always building a picture. She saw Elias walking across the dock and watched him come. He stopped a few feet from the paramedic unit. How bad are the ribs? He hit me twice on the left side, she said. 3rd or 4th, they think. I've had worse. Have you? No, she said after a moment. But it seemed like the right thing to say. She looked at him steadily. You aborted the demolition system. Yes. With a guessed code. It wasn't entirely a guess. I had context, she said. I remember. The thermal blanket had slipped off one shoulder and she didn't adjust it. She looked at him with the same expression she'd been using all night, the one that was building a picture. Who are you, Elias Varden? He considered that. It was not a simple question, and she was not asking it simply. She was asking it the way someone asked it when they had spent an evening watching a person operate in a way that didn't match any file they had on them. Right now, he said. I'm the overnight maintenance worker who needs to get home before his daughter wakes up. Something moved in her expression. Something that was not the calculated assessment she'd been running. Something more unguarded than that. Your daughter. She's 9. She had a bad dream tonight. He paused. She's going to need pancakes. Celeste looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out at the gray-lit dock and the controlled chaos of the federal scene, and she exhaled, a long, slow breath that released something she had been holding for 6 hours. Go home, she said. Not dismissively, the way you said it to someone who had earned the right to go. The paramedics need to finish, he said, looking at the cuff on her arm. I know. She glanced at the paramedic who was noting the reading on a tablet, then back at Elias. The pen, she said. In the garage. I didn't know who would find it. I just knew someone had to. I know. I'm glad it was you. He nodded once and turned and walked back across the loading dock. Victor was near the access road, speaking to 2 federal agents, standing in the easy way of a man who had done what he came to do and was now cooperating with the aftermath without drama. He caught Elias's eye as Elias passed and gave a small nod that covered more ground than most conversations. Elias walked down the service road to where Victor's car was still parked on the track off the main road, and he sat in the passenger seat and called Mrs. Galvez, who answered on the second ring in the voice of someone who had not slept. "He's okay," Mrs. Galvez said before he could speak. "She's still sleeping." "Thank you," he said. "I'm on my way." He sat in the car for a moment before starting it, his head back against the headrest, looking at the car ceiling in the pre-dawn gray that was coming through the windshield. The shoulder ached, the forearm stung. Somewhere in the facility behind him, Rourke Danner was in the back of a federal vehicle with 7 years of answers in a communications file, and Elias hadn't processed any of it yet. Hadn't let himself, because processing it required sitting still with it, and sitting still with it required more space than the last several hours had allowed. But he could hear the edge of it already. The specific quality of a weight that was beginning, very slowly, after a very long time, to feel like it might eventually be put down. Not yet, but eventually. He started the car. The road east was lit by the first pale suggestion of sunrise at its far end, the horizon beginning to separate itself from the dark, and Elias drove toward it, through the scrubland and the reddish clay shoulders of the service track and back onto the main road, where the city began to reassemble itself around him. First the industrial margin, then the commercial streets, then the residential blocks, with their parked cars and their dark windows and their ordinary lives running on sleep, while the night had been what the night had been. He parked in the lot of his building at 6:12 a.m., sat for a moment. Then he went upstairs, let himself in quietly, and found Nora exactly where Mrs. Galvez had said she was, asleep, one arm thrown over her head, her dark hair across the pillow in the specific disorder of a 9-year-old who slept without self-consciousness. Her face was entirely peaceful in the way children's faces were when nothing had reached them yet. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. He stood there for a while. Then he went to the kitchen and got out the mixing bowl and the flour and the eggs, and he made pancake batter, and he was on the second batch when he heard her feet on the floor, and then her voice from the hallway. "Dad, you're home." "I'm home," he said. She came into the kitchen in her pajamas, her hair in full morning chaos, and stopped at the counter with the expression of someone making a rapid assessment of available information. "You made pancakes." "I did." "Are they the good ones or the healthy ones?" "The good ones." She considered this. Then she climbed onto the kitchen stool and picked up the fork he'd already set out for her, and she said, "You look tired." "I'm okay." "You have something on your arm." She pointed at the dressing on his forearm. "I scratched it at work. It's fine." She looked at it for a moment with the particular scrutiny of a 9-year-old assessing whether she was being told the whole truth. Then she looked up at him. "Were you a hero?" she asked. The question was direct and simple, the way her questions always were when she'd been thinking about something. He turned back to the stove and flipped the pancakes. "No," he said. "I was just there." She seemed to consider this answer. He heard her tap the fork on the counter twice, her thinking rhythm. "Okay," she said finally. And then, "Can we put the chocolate chips in the next batch?" "Already planned," he said. He stood at the stove and made pancakes, and the morning came through the kitchen window in the ordinary way that mornings came, indifferent to what the night had been, and Nora ate and talked about something that had happened at school 2 days ago that he'd already heard but listened to again, and the batter was almost gone when his phone buzzed on the counter. A text from a number he didn't have saved. "Formal debrief Monday. You'll receive official documentation by end of week. Ellison." And then, 30 seconds later, a second text from the same number. "Thank you." He set the phone down and poured the last of the batter. He didn't know yet what the formal documentation would change, or how long the review process would take, or what it would feel like when the record was officially different from what it had said for 7 years. He didn't know what came next for Northwatch or Rourke, or the investigation that was going to unfold from the communications archive over the coming months. He didn't know what Celeste Arden would do with what she'd learned about her company, or what she would think about the janitor who had known a military abort code. He knew that Nora was asking him whether he had more butter for the pancakes. He got the butter from the refrigerator. "Dad?" Nora said, in the tone that meant she had circled back to something. "The scratched arm." "Was work tonight more interesting than usual?" He looked at her over the counter. She was watching him with those direct, clear eyes that she had gotten from her mother and that still occasionally caught him off guard with their accuracy. "A little," he said. She nodded slowly, processing. Okay, she said, and let it go, because she understood. In the way children understood things they hadn't been taught explicitly. That some questions could wait, and that the person standing at the stove making her pancakes was home, and that was the part that mattered right now. Elias put the butter on the table and sat down across from his daughter, and the morning settled around them both like something ordinary, which was the best thing it could possibly have been. The formal debrief was held on Monday in a federal building downtown, in a conference room that smelled of recycled air and institutional coffee, and it lasted 6 hours. Elias sat across from Ellison and 2 other investigators whose names he committed to memory out of habit, and 2 lawyers whose names he did not bother with because they were not there for him. They went through everything: the document he found, the garage, the video analysis, the soil, room 39, the shaft, the loading dock, the abort code. They recorded it and they questioned it, and they asked him to repeat sections of it in different orders, which was standard practice for identifying inconsistencies in a timeline, and which produced none, because Elias's memory for operational sequence had always been precise to a degree that had impressed his commanding officers and occasionally unsettled them. At the 4-hour mark, Ellison slid a folder across the table. "This is the preliminary finding on the communications archive," she said. "You don't have to read it here, but I wanted you to have it in person." He looked at the folder. He did not open it immediately. Summary. Rourke Danner was operating as a freelance intelligence broker from at least 2014 onwards. He had relationships with multiple private buyers, and he used his proximity to active military operations through his contracting work to source intelligence and sell it. She paused. 7 years ago, he was contracted by a third party to compromise a specific SEAL team movement schedule. He was paid for the coordinates and the timing. The payment is documented. The communication is dated and authenticated. She held his gaze. "It was not your intelligence failure. The ambush was purchased. You were set up." The room was quiet. One of the unnamed lawyers shifted in his chair. Elias looked at the folder. He had known it in some form since Ellison told him in the ops room at Northwatch. But knowing a thing in an adrenaline-soaked moment at 5 in the morning and knowing it sitting at a table in daylight with a documented folder in front of you were different experiences. The second one had more room in it, more space for what the thing actually meant. 3 men. Calloway, Dresser, Park. Their faces were as clear to him now as they had been 7 years ago, which was something he had not fully expected. That time would not blur them. He had thought, when he was younger and knew less about how memory worked, that the sharpness would eventually soften. It hadn't. They were still precise. They would probably always be precise. But now the weight of them was different. Still heavy. Still real. But it was no longer his fault in the way it had been his fault for 7 years. And that distinction, which he had not fully allowed himself to believe until this moment, was the thing that made his chest do something complicated and quiet that he pressed through without making anything of it at the table. He opened the folder. He read the relevant sections. He closed it. "What happens to Rourke?" he asked. "Federal charges. Minimum 12 counts. Espionage, conspiracy, kidnapping, weapons charges, the Northwatch operation itself. His lawyers are already talking, which means they know what the evidence looks like." Ellison folded her hands on the table. "He will not be in a position to be anyone's problem for a very long time." And Gavin. Gavin Strake has been remarkably quiet, which is what people are when their lawyers have looked at the documentation and told them to be quiet. The shell company network goes back 4 years. We have transaction records, communication logs, and the testimony of 2 of Rourke's men who have already decided that cooperation is more useful than loyalty. She paused. "He'll plead eventually. They usually do when the evidence is that thorough." Elias nodded. He looked at the folder again, at the cover, at his own name on the label. "My record. The formal amendment process takes approximately 60 days. You'll receive official notification." She paused. "There will also be a commendation for Northwatch, for the recovery of the drive and Celeste Arden's safe return." He thought about that for a moment, about what a commendation meant in the context of what he was now, what he had spent 7 years becoming, and whether the formal acknowledgement of something he'd done one night would feel like anything in particular. "I'd rather it not be public." "That's a reasonable request. I'll note it." She looked at him with the expression she'd worn at several points over the course of this, the one that was not quite assessment and not quite something warmer, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. There's one more thing. From Celeste Arden. She slid a second envelope across the table. Sealed. Celeste's name on the return label. Handwritten. She asked me to give it to you here, Ellison said. She said you'd probably read it more carefully if it didn't arrive at your apartment. Elias looked at the envelope. He almost smiled. It was exactly the kind of thing Celeste Arden would calculate correctly. He put it in his jacket pocket and took it home. He read it at the kitchen table after Nora had gone to school, with the apartment quiet around him and the morning coming through the window at the angle it came in October, low and thin and honest in the way autumn light was honest. No warmth in it hadn't earned. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, and it was not what he'd expected. He had expected formal language, the kind of composed, professional communication that Celeste Arden projected in every interaction he had observed. What he got instead was something more uneven. The handwriting itself changed slightly in places, the pressure of the pen heavier in some paragraphs than others, the way writing changed when the person writing it was moving faster than their composed self could manage. She wrote about the chair in room 39, about the 6 hours, about the specific experience of counting footsteps in the dark and running mental calculations about whether anyone was looking in the right direction. She wrote about the pen, how she had found it in her blazer pocket and understood, in the moment the van door closed, that it might be the only communication she was going to get to make, and how she had placed it with her foot against the drain grate in the parking garage, angled east, and had no way of knowing if anyone would see it, or if anyone would know what it meant, or if it mattered at all. She wrote, "I had been walking past you for 2 years. I thought I was someone who noticed people. I was wrong about that, and I've spent the time since Northwatch being honest with myself about what that means. Not just about you, but about the way I'd structured my attention. Who I thought was worth observing carefully. Who I'd decided, without deciding, was just background." She wrote, "You stopped Preston from finishing what he started with you, that day by the elevator, without saying a word. And I kept walking because I thought I'd done something useful. What I'd actually done was the minimum, and I'd felt good about it anyway. I'm telling you this because I think you deserve an honest accounting from me, not a polished one." The letter ended with a specific proposal, not phrased as a proposal, phrased as a question, careful and direct, which was how he had come to understand that Celeste phrased things when she actually cared about the answer. He read it twice. Then he folded it and set it on the table and looked at the window for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called the number she had written at the bottom. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Elias. How are the ribs?" "Cracked. 2 of them. The doctor said 6 weeks, I said 4. We compromised at 5 and both know it's going to be 4. A brief pause. "How was the debrief?" "Long. Thorough. Ellison is thorough." "She is." Another pause. "Did you read the letter?" "Yes." "And?" He looked at the window again. Outside, a delivery truck was making its way down the block, and someone was walking a large dog that was not interested in walking at the pace its owner wanted, and the city was doing the ordinary things cities did on Monday mornings in October. "The position you described," he said, "risk assessment and internal security. In-house, not contracted out." "Yes." "Regular hours. No travel without advance notice." "That's the structure I had in mind. I'm not going to lie to you and say it would never be complicated or that there wouldn't be demands on your time that conflicted with Nora's schedule. It would sometimes be complicated, but the baseline would be yours to design." He thought about the mop cart against the lobby wall, about the overnight hours, the quiet floors, the version of invisibility he had chosen and maintained, and that had served a purpose until the night it hadn't been enough. He had not been unhappy in those years. That was the thing he had come to understand in the days since Northwatch, sitting with it quietly while Nora was at school and the apartment was silent. He had not been unhappy. He had been safe, in the specific way a person was safe when they had reduced their world to dimensions they could control. And there was a difference between safe and alive that he had stopped examining because examining it was expensive. "I have conditions," he said. "Tell me." "No title that requires explaining to Nora's teachers. She already has to deal with your dad works nights. I'm not adding layers to it." "Fair. What else?" "Victor Say leads the physical security restructuring. He's better at it than whoever you currently have, and he's already proven it. I'd already decided that. What else? I start when I decide I'm ready, not on a corporate timeline. A pause, not a resistant one, a considered one. Define ready. When I've slept through a full night without running tactical assessments of my own apartment layout. Another pause. Then, quietly, is that happening? Less than it was a week ago, he said. So, progress. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was not empty. The quality of quiet that meant she was sitting with what he'd said without trying to fix it or reframe it. He had noticed that about her during the night at Northwatch, the way she processed difficult information without immediately reaching for a response. It was rarer than it should have been. Take the time you need, she said. The position will be there. I know, he said. I'll take it. The 60 days that followed were not easy in the way recovery was not easy. Not dramatic, not a clear progression, but the accumulation of ordinary mornings that were slightly more ordinary than the ones before them. He slept better by week 3. By week 5, he had stopped checking the apartment layout at night, mostly. By week 7, he was doing it occasionally but consciously, which was different from doing it automatically, and the difference was significant even if it didn't look like much from the outside. The official documentation arrived on a Tuesday, in a plain envelope with a federal return address, and he opened it at the kitchen table the same way he'd opened Celeste's letter, with the apartment quiet, Nora at school, the October light replaced now by the thinner gray of November. The language was formal and precise, and full of the specific bureaucratic careful stepping that government documents used when correcting official records. And underneath all the language it said what Ellison had told him it would say. The finding of command error had been vacated. The record had been amended. The commendation for actions at Northwatch Station was attached as a separate page. He read it. He set it on the table next to Celeste's letter, which he had kept there without fully intending to. He sat for a while. He thought about Marcus Calloway and James Dresser and David Park, who had been 26 and 29 and 31 respectively, and who had not come back from a mountainside in a country they had served in with full commitment and the trust that the intelligence they were given was real. The amended record did not give them back. The vacated finding did not change the specific weight of their names, which Elias had carried so long he no longer noticed the carrying except in moments when he stopped moving. But it changed something. He had spent 7 years believing, underneath everything, that he had failed them, that his decisions, his leadership, his failures of judgment had been the mechanism of their deaths. That was the version of events he had been handed and had accepted because there was no other version available, and he had built a life around the acceptance of it, around the idea that the least he could do was make himself small enough that he couldn't damage anything else important. The version was wrong, and the wrongness of it did not erase 7 years of carrying the right version's weight, but it changed what he was carrying, and that mattered. He did not know yet exactly how much it mattered or in what specific ways, but it mattered. He folded both letters and put them in the drawer in his bedroom where he kept the few things he kept carefully. Then he called Victor Say. "The debrief team wants to speak with you this week," he said when Victor picked up. And I said yes to Celeste's proposal. Victor was quiet for a moment. "When do you start?" "When I'm ready." "Which is?" "Monday," Elias said. "Probably." Victor made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Monday it is," he told Nora that weekend. Not the whole story. She was 9, and the whole story had sections that were not for 9-year-olds, not yet, but the outline of it, the shape. That something had happened at work, that he had helped someone who needed help, and that because of it, he was going to have a different job now, a better one, that he would be home in the evenings. She listened with the focused seriousness she brought to things she understood were important, sitting on the couch with her knees up and her arms wrapped around them. "Different how?" she asked. "I'll work days, regular hours." He paused. "I won't be cleaning floors anymore." "What will you do?" "Help keep people safe." He thought about how to say the next part. "You know how I was in the Navy?" "You were a SEAL," she said. Matter of fact. He went still. "You know that?" "Mrs. Kowalski on the 3rd floor told me. She said her son was in the Navy too, and he recognized something about how you walk." Nora looked at him with the expression of someone who had been storing this information patiently. "She said it 2 years ago. I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. 9 years old, dark eyes that didn't miss things. I should have told you, he said. She shrugged, a small philosophical motion. You told me the stuff I needed, that you loved me and you were coming home. A pause. The other stuff is just history, right? You said that about a lot of things. The important thing isn't where something started, it's what it turned into. He did not know whether she fully understood the weight of what she'd just said, or whether she was repeating a version of something she'd absorbed from a book, or a teacher, or the particular atmosphere of a household built by someone who had believed it without saying it directly. Either way, it landed on him with the specific precision of a truth he had needed to hear from someone other than himself. Yeah, he said, that's right. She uncurled from the couch and came and sat next to him, close, and after a moment she put her head against his arm the way she had since she was 4 years old, when she wanted to be near him without making a production of it. They sat like that for a while. Dad, she said eventually. Is the new job going to be dangerous? He thought about how to answer honestly. Sometimes, he said. Not usually, but sometimes. Are you good at it? I used to be, he said. I think I still am. She nodded against his arm. Then, okay? And that was the end of the conversation, because she trusted him with it. And that trust, simple and complete, was the most complicated thing he had ever been given. He started on a Monday, as planned, and the first 3 weeks were an adjustment in the way any significant change was an adjustment. Not comfortable, not seamless, marked by the specific friction of a person and a system learning each other. The new division had a small team initially: Elias, Victor, 2 analysts that Celeste had hand-selected from the company's existing security and IT departments, and a protocols officer named Lindgren, who had a background in compliance and the useful quality of not being impressed by anyone's resume, which kept the early meetings honest. The work was not glamorous, most of it was not. It was systematic, reviewing existing security architecture for vulnerabilities, auditing the culture that had produced the situation with Gavin, building a framework for how the company would identify and report internal risk without creating a surveillance environment that punished normal human behavior. Elias had never built a system from scratch in a corporate environment, and it showed in the early weeks in ways that Lindgren pointed out with the directness he appreciated, and Victor smoothed over with the political awareness that Elias was still developing. There were things Elias was good at immediately and things he was not good at all. He was good at reading people, at sitting in a meeting and knowing within the first 5 minutes which person in the room was performing competence versus actually having it, which person was afraid and hiding it, which person had an agenda they weren't naming. He was not good at the reporting structure, at the email conventions, at the particular corporate grammar of communicating difficult conclusions in language that left the recipient able to save face. Victor helped him with that. Lindgren helped him with that. He got better at it slowly, which was the only pace things got better at. The managers who had created the culture that allowed Gavin to operate for 4 years. The ones who had built fiefdoms of silence around their departments, who had dismissed concerns from below them as a matter of professional habit, who had done to dozens of employees what Preston Hollis had tried to do to Elias in the hallway. 3 of them were let go in the first month. The others were put through a process that Celeste designed and Elias provided input for, and that was uncomfortable for everyone involved, including the people implementing it, which was a sign it was probably real. Celeste had told him in a meeting in the second week, with 4 other people in the room, that the company had nearly been destroyed not by Gavin's intelligence, but by a culture that had trained people not to see the ones they looked past. She said it plainly, and she said it in a room where the people who needed to hear it were present, and nobody on the executive team said anything for a few seconds after she finished, because she had said it precisely enough that there was nothing to add and nowhere comfortable to redirect. She was, Elias had concluded by the end of the first month, very good at her job. Not in the way that people who were used to being called very good at their jobs were good at them, where the competence had calcified into confidence that no longer questioned itself. She was good in the way that people were good when they had been shaken recently and were honest about what the shaking revealed. She made decisions faster than most people, but revisited more of them than most people, which was a combination that only worked if you weren't too invested in being right the first time. He understood her, he had decided, better than he had expected to. What he had not expected was the other part. It developed slowly, which was probably the only way it could have developed given who they both were. There was no single moment, no identifiable point where the professional relationship shifted into something with additional weight. It was the accumulation of things, a conversation that ran 30 minutes longer than scheduled because neither of them ended it. A Tuesday afternoon when she had come by the risk assessment office and stood in the doorway looking at the mapping he'd done on the whiteboard and stayed to walk through it with him for 2 hours in a way that was genuinely interested rather than supervisory. The evening she met Nora, not arranged, accidental, Elias picking Nora up from a late school activity and running into Celeste in the lobby, and Nora looking at her with the same direct assessment she brought to everything important, and then looking at her father with a very specific 9-year-old expression that he filed away for later. It was Nora who said it first, which was not a surprise. Nora said most important things first in their household because she had not yet learned to talk herself out of them. "You like her," she told him one evening in December, entirely without preamble, from the kitchen table where she was doing homework. Elias looked up from the incident report he'd been reviewing at the counter. "She's my employer." "You like her, though?" Not a question. He put the report down. "Nora, I'm not saying it's weird," she said, with the tone of someone who had prepared for this conversation. "I'm saying I noticed, because you talk different about her than you talk about work people." She turned a page in her workbook. "And I checked and she's nice. I looked her up. She does a lot of stuff for the company's employees." A pause. "She also gave you a job that means you're home at dinner, which I think you should factor in." He stood at the counter and looked at his daughter, who was 9 years old and reading him with the accuracy of someone twice her age, and felt the particular combination of being known and being seen through that only certain people produced in him and that he had stopped expecting to feel. "It's complicated," he said. "It's always complicated," she said. "That's what you say when something is actually simple but feels complicated." He thought about that for a moment. Then he went back to the incident report, because some conversations needed to be not continued for a while before they were continued, and Nora understood this too and let him have the silence. But she was right. She was usually right about the things she bothered to say directly. He had coffee with Celeste on a Thursday afternoon in January, in the small conference room off her office that had gradually become an unofficial extension of the Risk Assessment Division's workspace. It was not remarkable. They had coffee in that room several times a week. What was different about this one was that the work they'd been reviewing was finished, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved to leave. The building was quiet in the way it was quiet in the late afternoon, the day shift winding down, the city outside the windows already dark at 4:30 because it was January. "I've been thinking about something you said," Celeste started. She had her hands around her coffee cup, the way she held things when she was thinking rather than performing. "In the letter, what I wrote about attention, about who I'd decided was background." "I remember. I've been watching myself for it since then, the habit." She looked at her cup. "It's more automatic than I wanted it to be. The categorizing. The decision about who's worth the full picture." She paused. "It's not malicious. It's just the way a certain kind of pressure teaches you to organize the world. You focus on what you think matters, and everything else becomes scenery." She looked up at him. "You were scenery to me for 2 years, and you were the most capable person in the building." "You stopped Preston," he said. "That wasn't scenery behavior. That was 30 seconds, and then I kept walking." She shook her head. "I'm not looking for absolution. I'm telling you I know what it was." A pause. "I don't want to do that with people anymore." He looked at her across the small table. In the window behind her, the city lights were starting to come on in the darkening afternoon, the particular texture of January in a city that kept going regardless of what the season was doing. "You're not doing it now," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. "I'm not." And then, because she was who she was, "I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I know what you're saying." "Elias, I know," he said. He said it quietly and without performance. "I've known for a while. I've been deciding what to do with it." She waited. "My daughter told me I liked you," he said. "Back in December." Celeste blinked. Then the corner of her mouth moved. "She's perceptive. Relentlessly." He put his coffee down. "She also said I talk different about you than I talk about work people." "Do you?" "Apparently." The small conference room held the particular quiet of a space where something was being said carefully that both people had been thinking about for longer than this moment. It was not a romantic quiet. It was more honest than that, more tentative, the specific hesitation of two people who had both been through enough to know that the feeling and the situation were not the same thing, and that confusing them was a way of losing both. "There's Nora to consider," he said. "That's not a reason against. But it's part of the math." "I understand that." She said it without the sound of someone saying the right thing. She said it with the sound of someone who had thought about it. "I don't approach this as something simple." "I know you don't." He looked at her. "That's part of why we're having this conversation." It did not resolve that afternoon into anything declared or decided. They talked for another hour about something else entirely, a security audit for the company's satellite offices that was coming up in March. And when he left at 6 o'clock to pick up Nora, the conversation that had happened between the one about attention and the one about satellite offices sat between them with a different quality than before it. Not a beginning. More like an acknowledgement. The kind that didn't require anything immediate because both people involved understood that some things developed at the pace they developed, and that rushing them was a way of making them into something smaller than they could be. Nora was standing at the school pickup line when he pulled up, and she got in the car and looked at him immediately. "You look different," she said. "I had a long day." "Good different or bad different?" He pulled out into traffic. "Good," he said. She buckled her seatbelt. "Okay," she said, and asked him what was for dinner, and the conversation moved on in the way conversations moved on. And Elias drove through the January city with the heat running and his daughter talking about something her teacher had said that she thought was wrong but wasn't sure. And he listened and gave his opinion when she asked for it, and the city moved past the windows in its ordinary way. 6 months after Northwatch, Aegis Meridian opened its new security operations center on the building's 4th floor, the renovated space where the old conference rooms had been, now reconfigured and purpose-built for the kind of integrated risk monitoring that Elias and Victor had spent 4 months designing. It was not a ceremonial opening. Celeste had been clear about that. It was a working space, not a showroom, and the people who used it were there to do work, not to attend an event. There was, however, a brief staff gathering in the late afternoon before the center went into full operation, because Lindgren had organized it, and nobody argued with Lindgren about logistics. Nora was there because it was a Saturday, and Elias hadn't arranged anything else, and because she had expressed, with her characteristic directness, that she wanted to see where he worked now that he worked somewhere worth seeing. She stood next to him in the new space with its monitors and its mapping displays and its clean sightlines that Elias had specified himself, and she looked at everything with the assessment of someone taking a serious inventory. "It's nice," she said. "Better than a mop bucket." "The bar was not high," he said. Victor, nearby, laughed. It was the first time Elias had heard him laugh without reservation, which was a small thing, and also not a small thing. Celeste came to stand on Nora's other side. She had been across the room speaking to Lindgren, and she crossed to them with the ease of a person who had been around the three of them enough times over the past months that the geometry was familiar. She looked at the room too, the way they were both looking at it, standing beside them rather than in front of them. "What do you think?" she asked Nora. Nora considered. "My dad designed it." "He did, most of it." "Then it's good," Nora said, with the simple certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. And then she looked up at Celeste with those direct eyes and said, "He talks about you at home, just so you know," and walked off toward the snack table that Lindgren had set up in the corner, leaving behind a silence that had a specific texture. Elias looked at the ceiling briefly. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, so only he could hear, "Does she always do that?" "Yes," he said. "She gets it from her mother." The room hummed with the low conversation of the gathered staff, the new monitors cycling through their initial displays, the city visible through the 4th floor windows in the last of the Saturday afternoon light. It was ordinary in the way the best things were ordinary. Not spectacular, not transformed, just present and real and enough. He looked at the room he had built. He thought about the maintenance tunnel at Northwatch, the ventilation shaft, the concrete floor, the pen pointing east. He thought about the mop cart against the lobby wall, 2 years of invisible mornings, the specific discipline of being someone that people looked past without meaning to. He had spent years telling himself that the smaller life was the right life, that the safest thing he could give Nora was a father who had reduced himself to a manageable size, who had put the dangerous parts away, who would not bring anything home that could break what was already carefully built. He had believed that, with the particular conviction of someone who needed to believe it. What he understood now, not in a dramatic way, not in the way people understood things in movies where a single moment unlocked everything, was that the belief had been half right and half a lie he had needed to tell himself. The half that was right. Nora needed him present, consistent, home. She needed a father who showed up, who made pancakes on Saturday mornings, who listened to stories he had already heard and gave opinions when asked and was there in the mornings when she woke up from bad dreams. The half that was a lie, that being those things required him to be nothing else, that the version of himself he had buried was a danger to the version of himself Nora needed, rather than a part of the same person that she also deserved to know. He had thought the courage and the love were competing things. They weren't. They had never been. He had been carrying both of them the whole time, and the only thing that had kept them feeling like opposites was the story he'd been telling himself about what happened 7 years ago in a place that Rourke Danner had turned into a transaction. Nora came back from the snack table with 2 cookies and handed him one without comment. He took it. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Are you happy?" He looked at the room, at Victor talking with Lindgren, at the monitors running their first real cycles, at Celeste a few feet away talking to one of the analysts with the focused attention she gave everything she looked at directly. He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, holding a cookie and asking him a simple question with serious eyes. The honest answer was not a simple yes. It was more textured than that. There were still nights that were harder than others, still the particular weight of 3 names he would carry for the rest of his life, still the slow work of being a different kind of person in a different kind of life than the one he'd built for himself for 7 years. There were things that would take more time and things that would never fully resolve and things he was still learning to say out loud. But underneath all of that, something had shifted. Something that had been locked in a specific position for a very long time had moved, and the movement had been painful in the way locked things were painful when they moved. And on the other side of the pain was something that was not perfect, was not smooth, was not the version of resolution that happened in the last 5 minutes of a story, but was real. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." Nora nodded with the expression of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. She ate her cookie. She looked around the room with the proprietary satisfaction of someone standing somewhere that belonged to her family. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, full of its own noise and its own lives, none of which knew or cared what had happened in an underground room at Northwatch Station, or a parking garage at midnight, or a kitchen table on a Sunday morning with a mixing bowl and a 9-year-old asking for chocolate chips. That was fine. That was how it should be. Some things didn't need to be known widely. Some things were just true, quietly, stubbornly, in the particular way that the most important things were true, without announcement, without ceremony, without the clean ending that made them easy to explain. A man had spent 7 years making himself invisible, and the night he was finally seen by the wrong people first, and then by the right ones, he had discovered that the life he'd been protecting was not only what he thought it was, that it could hold more, that he could hold more and still be standing after. He finished the cookie. He looked at his daughter, who had moved on to examining one of the new monitoring displays with the technical curiosity she brought to things she didn't yet understand but intended to. He looked at Celeste, who caught his eye across the room with the particular directness she brought to everything she looked at. He looked at Victor, who was not looking at him at all, but was simply there, the way solid people were simply there, present and reliable and part of the structure. Later that evening, after the gathering had dispersed and Victor had locked up, and Nora had been collected and was in the back seat asking about dinner, Elias walked through the building's lobby on the way out. The overnight crew was beginning their shift. Different faces than the ones he used to know. A new rotation. The building continuing its cycles the way buildings did. Near the service elevator, a young man in a maintenance uniform was struggling with an overturned cart, cleaning supplies spilled across the floor. The wheel mechanism jammed in a way that required 2 hands and a specific angle to clear. He was crouching over it with the expression of someone who had tried 3 approaches and was about to try a 4th. Elias handed Nora's backpack to Nora and crouched down next to the young man. "Here," he said, "hold this side." The young man looked at him with surprise. The specific surprise of someone who had not expected the well-dressed stranger from the upper floors to crouch on the lobby floor next to a spilled mop cart. Together, they got the wheel cleared and the cart upright in about 45 seconds. "Thank you," the young man said. He seemed uncertain of the protocol. "You'd do the same," Elias said. He stood, took Nora's backpack back, and walked toward the lobby doors. Behind him, at the far end of the corridor, the young man was finishing the righting of the cart. Above him, the building's monitors cycled through their feeds. The overnight cycle had begun. Nora put her hand in his as they walked out into the January night. "That was nice," she said. "It was nothing," he said. She thought about this as they walked to the car. "I don't think it was nothing," she said. "I think that's how it starts. Small things." She looked up at him. "That's what you always say." He had said that. He didn't remember when, but he had said it, and she had stored it the way she stored things, and brought it back now without understanding the full weight of it, which was how the best things were sometimes taught, not through explanation, but through accumulation, through the steady practice of someone living a certain way long enough that the people watching it absorbed the shape of it without being told. "Yeah," he said. "That's how it starts." They reached the car. The city moved around them in its January pace, indifferent and continuous, full of lives he would never know, full of people who walked past each other every day without seeing what they were walking past. He opened the car door for Nora. She got in, immediately finding something in her backpack, already on to the next thing the way children were always already on to the next thing. He stood for a moment with his hand on the door. 7 years ago, he had walked away from a version of himself that had cost him something he could not get back. He had told himself it was for Nora, and it was for Nora, but it was also for the part of him that had needed to stop moving long enough to be still and know that he could survive the stillness. He had survived it. And now the stillness was not an ending, but a foundation, the solid thing underneath the life he was building, not instead of who he had been, but alongside it, the courage and the love no longer in opposition, but running together in the particular way they had always been meant to run, as parts of the same person who had finally stopped trying to be less than he was. He got in the car. Nora looked up from her backpack. "Celeste is coming to dinner next week," she said, matter of fact. He turned to look at her. "I didn't know that." "I invited her." She said it with the complete calm of someone who had made a reasonable decision and was comfortable with it. She said yes. "I told her you make good pasta on Thursdays." A pause. "You do make good pasta on Thursdays." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. "You could have asked me first," he said. "Would you have said yes?" He started the car. "Yes," he said. Nora nodded, satisfied, and went back to her backpack. He pulled out of the parking lot and into the city, and the January night moved past the windows, and somewhere behind them, the building they had just left continued its cycles, and somewhere ahead of them, a Thursday evening was already becoming something he was looking forward to, and Elias Varden drove his daughter home through the ordinary dark, carrying nothing he couldn't carry, finally.